The ocean looked calm, and that was the lie. Saipan rose from the Pacific as a green ridge of volcanic stone and jungle, quiet from a distance, ordinary at first glance. But in the summer of 1944, this island carried a weight far heavier than its size. What happened here would decide not just the next battle, but how the war itself would end. Saipan was not just another island in the Pacific chain. It was a threshold. From its airfields, the Japanese home islands would finally be within reach, not in theory, in reality. Bombers could fly from Saipan straight to the heart of Japan. That single fact transformed the island from terrain into destiny. For the United States, Saipan had to be taken. For Japan, it could not be lost. When the invasion began, the scale was overwhelming. Ships filled the horizon. Guns thundered from the sea. Aircraft roared overhead in waves that never seemed to stop. The beaches erupted under fire. Sand churned into smoke and debris. Men moved forward knowing the first steps would be the most exposed, the most lethal, and the most necessary. There was no shortcut onto Saipan. Every yard had to be earned. But unlike many islands before it, Saipan was not empty. Civilians lived here, families, children, and the war did not spare them. Japanese defenses were deep and determined, cave systems honeycombed the hills. Artillery was hidden in jungle folds. Positions were designed not to stop the invasion at the waterline, but to pull it inland, where heat, terrain, and exhaustion could do their work. Night attacks came suddenly. Silence was never safe. The jungle erased direction and amplified fear. As the fighting dragged on, something darker emerged. Civilians were caught between advancing forces, and a regime that had taught them surrender was worse than death. Entire families fled into the hills. Many never returned. The cliffs of Saipan would become symbols not of battle alone, but of tragedy on a scale that still echoes. For the soldiers fighting inland, Saipan became relentless. Heat drained strength. Water ran short. Casualties mounted from bullets, disease, and exhaustion alike. Positions thought secure erupted again from unseen tunnels. Battles were fought at close range, often without warning. Progress was measured in days that felt endless, and nights that offered no rest. Then came the moment that reached far beyond the island. When Saipan fell, the consequences rippled straight into Tokyo. A Japanese prime minister resigned. The illusion of strategic safety collapsed. The reality of defeat crept closer to home. Saipan was not just a battlefield victory. It was a psychological fracture, proof that the war had crossed a line from which it could not retreat. From the airfields carved into its soil, bombers would soon rise and head north, changing the nature of the war forever. The Pacific conflict was no longer distant. It was approaching the homeland itself. The Battle of Saipan matters because it shows how wars pivot not only on firepower, but on meaning. It shows how geography becomes fate, how civilians become trapped inside strategy, how victory can carry a weight that no celebration can erase. Saipan was a place where courage, suffering, and consequence collided, and where the end of the war began to come into focus, long before anyone was ready to accept it. Tonight, we return to that island, to the beaches and jungles, to the caves and cliffs, to the battle that reshaped the Pacific War in ways no map could fully capture, to Saipan. And before we continue, if you're still here, listening carefully, if these long, immersive journeys into history help you slow down, focus, or sit with stories that deserve patience and respect, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. I'm a small creator, building this channel one story at a time, thoughtfully, carefully, and without turning the past into noise. When you subscribe, you help keep this kind of calm, in-depth storytelling alive. If this space gives you perspective, understanding, or simply somewhere steady to rest your thoughts, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the history of the Battle of Saipan, May 18th, 1944. Lieutenant Benjamin Tills pushed his F-6F Hellcat into a steep dive over the Philippine Sea, the engine screaming as the altimeter unwound. Below him, Saipan emerged from morning haze like a green dagger pointed at the heart of the Pacific. His camera clicked automatically, capturing what would become the most studied reconnaissance photographs of the war. Black puffs of anti-aircraft fire began dotting the sky around him. Tills pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing him into his seat, and made another pass. He had to get this right. Everything depended on what these photographs would reveal. The island stretching beneath Tills' wings was 12 miles long and 5.5 miles wide, 71 square miles of volcanic rock, coral beaches, and sugarcane fields. But to American war planners, Saipan represented something far more significant than its modest dimensions suggested. It sat 1,500 miles from Tokyo, exactly within range of the new B-29 Superfortress bombers that were just beginning to roll off assembly lines in American factories. If American forces could capture this island, they could reach the Japanese homeland with conventional bombers for the first time since Jimmy Doolittle's desperate one-way raid in 1942. The Japanese understood this arithmetic perfectly. In 1943, Imperial headquarters had designated Saipan as part of the absolute national defense sphere, the inner ring of territories that Japan would defend to the death. What had once been a sleepy colonial outpost was now an unsinkable aircraft carrier, bristling with weapons and packed with troops. As Tills's photographs were rushed to the intelligence room aboard the USS Lexington, officers hunched over light tables with magnifying glasses, counting and cataloging what they saw. The numbers were staggering. More than 1,000 defensive positions, caves, bunkers, concrete pillboxes scattered across the island's ridges and valleys. A Slido airfield on the southern tip, with 2 operational runways and revetments for dozens of aircraft, artillery positions hidden in the jungle, troops everywhere. And something else that made the intelligence officers pause: civilians, thousands of them, Japanese colonists who had turned Saipan into a thriving community over 2 decades of occupation. In the town of Garipan, the island's administrative center, more than 25,000 Japanese civilians lived in wooden houses, worked in shops, sent their children to schools. Sugar plantations covered the southern plains, worked by Korean and Okinawan laborers under Japanese supervision. This wasn't just a military target, it was a society. The Japanese garrison defending this society numbered approximately 31,000 troops, a mix of Army and Navy forces under separate commands, a division that would later prove catastrophic. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded the Army's 43rd Division and other ground units. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier, now found himself relegated to defending this small island, commanding naval ground troops and coastal defenses. The officer studied Tills's photographs late into the night, trying to determine which of those 1,000 defensive positions were real and which were decoys. They measured the thickness of concrete walls. They traced the likely paths of underground tunnels. They counted gun emplacements. But the photographs couldn't show them what mattered most: the depth of the defenses, the interconnected cave systems, the ammunition stockpiles buried 50 feet underground in chambers blasted from solid rock. In Tokyo, Japanese military planners pored over their own maps of Saipan, calculating how long the garrison could hold. The answer wasn't reassuring. American industrial might was producing ships, aircraft, and ammunition at rates that defied comprehension. But what choice did Japan have? If Saipan fell, B-29 bombers would rain destruction on Japanese cities with impunity. The war would come home. Civilians in Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya would experience what London and Berlin already knew: the terror of strategic bombing. For Japan's military leadership, there was no acceptable scenario in which Saipan fell to American forces. The mathematics of distance and bomber range allowed no middle ground. Either Saipan held, or Japan itself became vulnerable. This simple calculus meant that the coming battle would be fought with an intensity and desperation unlike anything yet seen in the Pacific War. Back aboard the Lexington, Tills's photographs were being reproduced and distributed to every ship in the invasion, fleet being assembled thousands of miles away. Marines and soldiers would study these images for weeks, memorizing terrain features, identifying landmarks, planning their routes inland from the beaches. But photographs could only reveal so much. They showed the surface of things, the visible world. They couldn't capture the determination of the defenders, the fanaticism that Japanese military culture had cultivated so carefully. They couldn't show the concrete bunkers built to withstand battleship guns, walls 4 feet thick with steel-reinforced roofs. They couldn't reveal the hospital caves stocked with supplies for months of resistance, or the ammunition dumps containing enough shells and bullets to kill thousands of attackers. The photographs showed an island. They didn't show a fortress. The town of Garapan in early 1944 presented an odd contrast to the military preparations transforming the rest of Saipan. Japanese families still went about their daily routines, shopping in stores, attending festivals, maintaining the rhythms of colonial life. Children played in streets that would soon become battlefields. Mothers hung laundry on lines strung between houses that would soon be reduced to ash and rubble. The civilian population had swelled beyond 25,000, including not just Japanese colonists but also Korean laborers, Okinawan farmers, and Chamorro natives who had lived on Saipan long before any Japanese arrived. These people went about their lives while, in the hills above them, soldiers dug caves and positioned artillery pieces. It was a doomed normalcy, the last peaceful days before the storm. Lieutenant Tills returned to the Lexington after his reconnaissance flight, landing with his fuel gauge showing empty. He climbed out of his cockpit, his flight suit soaked with sweat, and handed over the exposed film canisters to waiting intelligence officers. He didn't know yet that his photographs would be studied by admirals and generals, that they would inform the planning of the largest amphibious operation in Pacific War history to date. He only knew that the anti-aircraft fire over Saipan had been intense, that the island below him had bristled with weapons, that the Japanese were ready and waiting. In his debriefing, he told officers about the concentration of defenses he'd seen, the number of troops visible even from the air. One officer asked him what he thought about the island's defenses. Tills considered the question, remembering the tracers arcing up toward him, the black puffs of flak, the sense of hostile eyes watching from every hillside. "It's going to be hell," he said finally. "Absolute hell." The strategic importance of Saipan extended far beyond its potential as a bomber base, though that alone would have justified the coming bloodshed. The island was part of the Marianas chain, which served as Japan's inner defensive ring in the Pacific. If the Marianas fell, the entire edifice of Japanese defense collapsed inward. The Philippines would be exposed. Formosa would be vulnerable. The home islands themselves would stand naked before American power. Japanese war planners understood this with crystalline clarity. They had drawn their defensive perimeter carefully, trading space for time after the disastrous defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal. But now that perimeter was being tested. The Americans were coming, and they were coming to Saipan. What happened on this small island would determine the course of the war's final year. Would Japan be given time to prepare defenses of the home islands, to negotiate a conditional peace, to salvage something from looming defeat? Or would the Americans obtain the bases they needed to systematically destroy Japanese cities from the air? The answers to these questions were about to be written in blood on Saipan's beaches and ridges. As May turned to June in 1944, the garrison on Saipan intensified its preparations. Soldiers worked around the clock, expanding cave systems. Positioning artillery pieces, laying communications wire, they dug trenches and built bunkers. They positioned machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire across every beach and valley. They prepared defensive positions in depth, understanding that American naval bombardment would destroy anything exposed on the surface. The real defense would come from underground, from positions that could survive even direct hits from battleship guns. Japanese military doctrine called for grinding attritional warfare, making the Americans pay for every yard of ground in blood. On Saipan, this doctrine would be applied with ruthless thoroughness. The garrison knew that reinforcement was impossible, that resupply was unlikely, that they were preparing to fight alone until death. This knowledge, rather than weakening their resolve, seemed to strengthen it. They would hold this island or die trying. For most of them, there would be no middle ground between those two outcomes. The American reconnaissance photographs had captured an island. What was coming would reveal whether photographs could truly prepare anyone for the reality of Saipan. March 19, 1944. Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood before a large map of the Pacific. his pointer tapping Saipan with decisive emphasis. Around the conference table sat the men who would plan and execute the largest amphibious operation yet attempted in the Pacific: Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, Lieutenant General Holland Smith, Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding from the Southwest Pacific, wanted all resources diverted to his Philippines campaign. But Nimitz had different ideas, and in this meeting, he was overruling MacArthur's objections. The Marianas, Nimitz argued, offered the shortest path to Japan. Saipan would fall first, then Tinian, then Guam. From those islands, B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo. The decision was made. Operation Forager would proceed. The magnitude of what they were planning was unprecedented in Pacific War history. Previous amphibious operations at Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Eniwetok had involved single divisions or reinforced regiments. Saipan would require an entire corps, 2 Marine divisions, and 1 Army division in the initial assault, with more forces in reserve. The numbers were staggering: 127,571 troops in total, with 71,000 assault troops in the first waves. 535 ships would transport this force across thousands of miles of ocean. 15 battleships would provide gunfire support. 21 aircraft carriers would deliver air cover. It would be, in every measurable way, the largest military operation the United States had yet mounted in the Pacific theater. The planning required to coordinate such massive forces stretched the limits of existing military logistics and communications. Vice Admiral Turner, a brilliant but difficult man, known for his volcanic temper, took charge of the overall naval operation. Turner had commanded amphibious forces at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and other Pacific battles. He understood amphibious warfare better than almost anyone in the Navy. He also understood that the lessons learned from previous operations, especially the disaster at Tarawa, where Marines had been slaughtered crossing a coral reef, had to inform every aspect of Saipan planning. Turner insisted on 3 days of preliminary naval bombardment. He demanded extensive underwater demolition, team reconnaissance of the beaches. He calculated ammunition requirements down to individual shell types, ensuring that ships would carry enough ordnance to support troops ashore for 30 days of sustained combat. His planning sessions lasted late into the night. Officers hunched over charts and tables, calculating tides, beach gradients, defensive positions, approach lanes. At Camp Tarawa on the Big Island of Hawaii, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions trained for the assault. These were veteran units, bloodied at Tarawa and elsewhere, but they trained as if they were green recruits. They practiced beach landings on coral reefs. They rehearsed communication procedures. They zeroed their rifles and test-fired their machine guns. They attended briefings where officers used terrain models and photographs to show them exactly what Saipan looked like, where they would land, what defenses they would face. The Marines absorbed this information with the grim professionalism of men who knew that some of them would die doing exactly what they were now practicing. There were no illusions. Tarawa had killed more than 1,000 Marines in 76 hours of fighting. Saipan was larger, more heavily defended, and more strategically important. The casualty estimates circulating among senior officers ranged from optimistic to catastrophic. The 27th Infantry Division, an Army National Guard unit from New York, trained separately in Hawaii. These soldiers had already fought at Makan Atoll and Eniwetok, performing capably if not spectacularly. But there was tension between the Army and Marine commands, a rivalry born of different institutional cultures and competing for resources. Marine commanders like Holland Smith, whose nickname Howlin' Mad reflected his temperament, viewed Army troops as insufficiently aggressive, too cautious in pushing attacks forward. Army officers viewed Marines as reckless and glory-seeking, taking unnecessary casualties through tactical rashness. These tensions simmered beneath the surface during training and planning. Later, they would explode into the most controversial command decision of the Pacific War. For now, though, all 3 divisions trained together, thousands of men rehearsing the choreography of amphibious assault. In San Diego, the enormous task of loading 535 ships proceeded around the clock. Longshoremen and Navy personnel worked 24-hour shifts, loading ammunition, food, medical supplies, vehicles, fuel, water, construction equipment. Everything needed to not just assault Saipan, but to occupy and develop it had to be loaded and carefully arranged so that the most immediately needed items would be accessible first. The logistics were nightmarish in their complexity. Ammunition alone represented a staggering calculation. How many shells for battleships, cruisers, destroyers, field artillery pieces, mortars, individual rifles? How many gallons of fuel for vehicles, aircraft, ships? How many meals for how many men for how many days? The numbers involved thousands of tons, millions of rounds, vast quantities of material being concentrated into a single armada. As ships pulled away from the docks, riding low in the water under the weight of their cargo, civilians watching from shore understood that something immense was happening, even if they didn't know the destination. Vice Admiral Turner established his headquarters aboard the USS Rocky Mount, an amphibious force flagship, specially designed for command and control. In his cabin, Turner kept detailed maps and operational plans, constantly updating them as new intelligence arrived from Saipan. He calculated acceptable losses, a grim arithmetic that reduced human life to percentages and ratios. If naval bombardment could suppress 80% of Japanese defenses, casualties might be manageable. If it suppressed less, the first wave might be slaughtered on the beaches. Turner knew the Tarawa lesson. Coral reefs and inadequate reconnaissance had forced Marines to wade hundreds of yards under fire, turning them into helpless targets. He was determined not to repeat that mistake. Underwater demolition teams, the precursors to modern Navy SEALs, would scout every approach to Saipan's beaches. They would map the reefs, identify obstacles, locate mines. This reconnaissance would be dangerous. Teams of nearly naked men swimming in daylight within rifle range of Japanese defenders. But Turner considered it essential. On June 11, 1944, the invasion fleet assembled at Eniwetok Atoll, a recently captured base in the Marshall Islands. Ships filled the lagoon. An impossible concentration of naval power spread across miles of turquoise water. Sailors standing on deck could see other ships in every direction, extending to the horizon. Battleships and carriers, cruisers and destroyers, transports and cargo ships, all floating together in ordered rows. It was the largest assembly of naval vessels ever concentrated in one place for a single operation. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet from his flagship USS Indianapolis, reviewed the assembled force with satisfaction. Spruance was the victor of Midway, the admiral who had destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in one day and turned the tide of the Pacific War. Now he commanded this massive armada, tasked with taking the war to Japan's inner defensive ring. The responsibility weighed heavily, but Spruance projected calm confidence to his subordinates. As the invasion fleet departed Eniwetok and steamed westward towards Saipan, the men aboard the ship settled into the routines of a long voyage. Marines cleaned weapons and wrote letters home. Sailors stood watches and maintained equipment. Officers conducted final briefings, going over landing plans one more time. The fleet moved in a vast formation, destroyers screening the perimeter against submarine attack, carriers in the center launching combat air patrols, transports and supply ships in protected positions. It was a floating city, self-sufficient and deadly, carrying enough firepower to destroy nations. The men knew where they were going. They had studied the intelligence photographs, memorized the maps, listened to the briefings. They knew the name, Saipan. Most had never heard of it before a few months ago. Soon they would never forget it. The final approach to Saipan brought a mixture of anticipation and dread. Veterans of previous campaigns tried to guess what this one would be like based on the intelligence they had received. Would the Japanese contest the landing on the beaches, or would they defend from inland positions? Would there be massed banzai charges or methodical defensive fighting? Would the terrain favor attackers or defenders? These questions had no certain answers until the first Marines hit the beaches and discovered the truth. On June 13, 1944, the fleet arrived off Saipan's coast. The island rose from the ocean like a dark promise. Green hills and white beaches, beautiful and lethal. the first phase was about to begin. The battleships turned broadside and elevated their guns. The thunder was about to start. For the men crowded aboard the transport ships, watching the island that would become their battlefield, there was nothing left to do but wait and prepare themselves mentally for what was coming. Some prayed, some joked nervously. Some simply stared at Saipan in silence, wondering if they would survive the next few days. The spear had been forged. Now it would be tested against the fortress. June 13th, 1944. 5:45 in the morning. Gunner's mate. First class. Robert Sherrod felt the USS Tennessee shudder beneath his feet before he heard the sound. Then the noise arrived, a physical force that seemed to compress the air itself. The battleship's 14-inch guns had fired their first salvo. Through the dim pre-dawn light, Sherrod watched the shells arc across 3 miles of ocean, climbing high before dropping toward Saipan. The explosions bloomed orange and black against the green hillsides. The bombardment had begun. For 3 days, the American fleet would pour more steel and explosive into Saipan than had been dropped on some entire European cities. The question was whether it would be enough. Inside a Japanese coastal defense bunker, Lieutenant Sakai Oba pressed himself against the concrete wall as the world outside exploded. Oba was 31 years old, a career Army officer who had fought in China and Manchuria before being assigned to Saipan. The bunker's walls were 4 feet of reinforced concrete, built to withstand anything except a direct hit from the largest naval guns. Even so, each impact shook dust from the ceiling and rattled equipment off tables. Through the bunker's narrow firing slit, Oba could see nothing but smoke and flashing light. The Americans were firing blind, he realized, just saturating the island with shells. It was terrifying and wasteful at the same time. Terrifying because of its sheer volume and power. Wasteful because most shells were landing in empty terrain or hitting already destroyed structures. The real defenses, the bunkers and caves where Japanese troops waited, were surviving. The bombardment followed a pattern that would repeat for 3 days. At dawn, the battleships would move into position and begin firing. Spotter planes would circle overhead, trying to identify targets through the smoke and dust. When spotters saw something intact, they would radio coordinates to the ships, and more shells would follow. At night, the bombardment would pause, allowing the smoke to clear. Japanese soldiers would emerge from their shelters, repair damaged positions where possible, and count their dead. Then dawn would come, and the thunder would resume. The Americans fired with methodical precision, working their way across the island sector by sector. They fired high-explosive shells to destroy structures. They fired armor-piercing shells against the thickest bunkers. They fired white phosphorus shells to burn vegetation and expose hidden positions. The variety of ordnance reflected years of accumulated knowledge about how to prepare a battlefield for infantry assault. On June 14th, the second day of bombardment, the underwater demolition teams went to work. These were the UDT men, frogmen who wore swim trunks, face masks, and flippers, carrying no weapons except knives. Their job was to swim to the reef line, map the bottom, identify obstacles, and mark lanes for landing craft. It was among the most dangerous work in the Navy. The teams approached the beaches in small boats, then slipped into the water and began swimming. Japanese defenders, who had been hiding in caves during the bombardment, emerged and opened fire on the swimmers. Machine gun bullets kicked up geysers of water. Mortar shells exploded in the surf. 4 UDT men were killed, 20 wounded, in just a few hours of work. But they completed their mission, mapping the approaches to every landing beach, identifying which reefs could be crossed and which couldn't, marking clear lanes with buoys that would guide the landing craft on D-Day. Aboard the Tennessee and other battleships, sailors worked with assembly line efficiency, loading shells that weighed as much as small cars. Each 14-inch shell required a team of men to lift and load. The guns fired so continuously that the barrels heated up, glowing dull red after prolonged firing. Gun crews sprayed water on the barrels to cool them between salvos. The smell of cordite filled the ship, a chemical stench that penetrated everywhere. Sailors' ears rang constantly despite wearing protection. The noise was so intense that conversation was impossible near the guns. Men communicated with hand signals and written notes. In the 3 days of bombardment, the fleet fired over 165,000 shells of various calibers. It was the most intensive naval bombardment yet conducted in the Pacific War, but in their underground positions, the Japanese defenders survived. General Saito had insisted on building the deepest, strongest fortifications possible. Many bunkers and caves were 50 feet underground, accessed through winding tunnels that dissipated blast waves. Ammunition was stored in chambers carved from solid rock. Command posts were located in caves with multiple entrances and exits. Communications wire was laid in buried conduits that naval shells couldn't sever. This defensive architecture represented 2 years of intensive labor by thousands of soldiers and Korean laborers. It also represented a sophisticated understanding of what modern naval bombardment could and couldn't achieve. The Japanese knew they couldn't prevent the bombardment. What they could do was survive it and emerge to fight when the Marines came ashore. Lieutenant Oba, emerging from his bunker during a lull on June 14th, surveyed the devastation above ground. The town of Garapan was gone, reduced to ash and rubble. Not a single building stood intact. Trees were splintered stumps. The ground was cratered as if by some geological catastrophe. But, as Oba knew, this surface destruction was largely irrelevant. The real fighting positions, the ones that mattered, were underground and largely intact. Japanese artillery pieces, carefully positioned in caves with narrow firing slits, had survived. Machine gun bunkers built into hillsides remained operational. The command structure was still functioning. Radio communications were working. Most importantly, the troops were alive and ready to fight. The American bombardment, for all its sound and fury, had not broken Saipan's defenses. As the bombardment entered its 3rd day on June 15th, the intensity increased. The fleet moved closer to shore, battleships and cruisers firing at nearly point-blank range. The Americans were attempting to destroy every possible defensive position before the troops landed. Fire support coordinators aboard the command ships checked off targets from long lists: bunkers, pillboxes, suspected artillery positions, communication centers. But identifying targets through the smoke and dust was nearly impossible. Spotter planes reported that most of the island was obscured by a pall of smoke that hung like a shroud. The spotters could see explosions and fires, but they couldn't determine what was being destroyed and what remained intact. This uncertainty would prove costly when the Marines landed in a few hours. Gunner's mate, Sherrod, watching from the Tennessee as the final barrage intensified, felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. Satisfaction because of the sheer power being demonstrated, the ability to completely dominate a battlefield from the sea. Unease because some instinct told him that the Japanese were still down there, waiting. He had seen photos of Pacific bunkers that had taken direct hits from 14-inch shells and survived. He knew that concrete 4 feet thick could withstand almost anything except a perfectly placed shot. And Saipan had more than 1,000 bunkers. How many had been destroyed? How many remained? As 0 hour approached and the bombardment built to its final crescendo, Sherrod realized that they would find out very soon. The thunder from the sea had been impressive, even awesome, but it hadn't won the battle. That would fall to the Marines who were, even now, climbing down cargo nets into landing craft, preparing to discover just how much of Saipan's fortress had survived the storm of steel and explosive that had been unleashed against it. The final salvos fired at 7:30 in the morning on June 15th were supposed to be a rolling barrage, walking inland ahead of the landing craft, keeping Japanese defenders pinned in their shelters until Marines were actually on the beach. But coordination proved difficult. Some ships fired too long, endangering the approaching landing craft. Others ceased fire too early, giving defenders time to man their weapons. As the last shells exploded and smoke drifted across Saipan's beaches, there was a moment of eerie silence. Then the landing craft emerged from the smoke, packed with Marines, heading for shore. The thunder had passed. The killing was about to begin. In his bunker, Lieutenant Oba gave the order to his men, "Move to fighting positions." The Americans were coming. Everything they had endured during 3 days of bombardment was just preparation. The real battle started now. 7 o'clock in the morning, June 15th, 1944. Private First Class. Robert Pepper Martin stood on the deck of the USS Cambria, staring down at the cargo net draped over the side of the ship. Below him, an LVTA-4 amphibious tractor bobbed in the waves, rising and falling with the swell. Martin was 20 years old, from a small town in Oklahoma, and he had never been more terrified in his life. Around him, other Marines from the 2nd Division were climbing down the nets, rifles slung across their backs, moving hand over hand toward the Amtraks below. Someone slipped, fell 10 feet, landed hard in the Amtrak. Martin heard the crack of breaking bone, a scream. Officers shouted orders. Martin took a breath and swung his leg over the ship's rail, beginning his descent. The climb down seemed to take forever. Martin's hands were slick with sweat, making the rope net difficult to grip. His pack, stuffed with ammunition, rations, and equipment, weighed 60 pounds and threw off his balance. Below him, the Amtrak rose and fell, metal hull clanging against the ship's side. The timing had to be perfect. Step off when the Amtrak was rising, not falling, or you drop too far and break your legs. Martin waited for the right moment, let go, and dropped. He landed hard, knees buckling, but kept his feet. Other Marines dropped around him. Soon the Amtrak was packed with 30 men, sitting shoulder to shoulder on metal benches. The vehicle's engine roared. They began moving toward shore. 8:40 in the morning. Martin's Amtrak was part of the first wave. 8,000 Marines hitting the beaches simultaneously across 7 miles of coastline. The beaches had been designated by color: Red Beach 1 and 2 on the left, Green Beach and Blue Beach in the center, Yellow Beach on the right. Martin was heading for Red Beach 2. Through the Amtrak's open top, he could see dozens of other vehicles around him, a formation stretching in both directions. The battleship bombardment had ceased. Carrier aircraft dove over the island, strafing and bombing. The island ahead was obscured by smoke, a dark silhouette rising from the sea. The Amtrak hit a shell crater. Dropped sickeningly, water rushed in through a hole torn in the hull. Men shouted. Someone bailed water with a helmet. They kept moving. 8:44, 4 minutes late. The Amtrak's front ramp dropped. Martin had a split second to see Red Beach 2, a strip of sand 40 yards wide, a seawall of coral rubble 3 feet high, thick vegetation beyond. Then the machine guns opened fire. The Marine next to Martin, a kid from Tennessee whose name he didn't know, took a round through the throat and fell backward. Martin lunged forward, splashed into knee-deep water, waded frantically toward the beach. Bullets kicked up geysers of water all around him. Men were screaming, falling, dying in the surf. Martin made the beach, threw himself flat behind a small rise of sand, gasping. He had been on Saipan for 30 seconds. The Japanese defensive fire was everything the planners had feared and worse. Machine guns positioned in bunkers on both flanks created interlocking fields of fire across the beaches. Mortar shells dropped into the landing zones with devastating accuracy. Artillery fire from the hills above crashed into the Amtraks as they disgorged their passengers. Japanese observers on Mount Tapochau and other high points could see the entire landing area. They directed fire with deadly precision. Some Amtraks were hit before reaching the beach, sinking in shallow water with their passengers trapped inside. Others made the beach only to be destroyed by direct hits that killed everyone aboard. The naval bombardment had failed to suppress the defenses. Now, Marines were paying the price. Martin joined a group of 5 Marines huddled behind the 3-foot seawall. A sergeant, blood streaming from a scalp wound, was shouting orders, trying to organize an assault on a concrete pillbox 50 yards inland. But every time someone moved, machine gun fire forced them down. An Amtrak tried to roll over the seawall to provide cover and took a direct hit from an artillery shell. The explosion threw Martin 10 feet, left his ears ringing. He checked himself for wounds, found none, looked around. The beach was chaos. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men crawled toward cover. Amtraks burned, sending black smoke into the sky. More landing craft kept coming, wave after wave, disgorging more Marines into the killing zone. 9:15 in the morning. Martin's unit had finally pushed 200 yards inland from Red Beach 2. A gain that cost 12 men killed or wounded out of 35. They were pinned behind a low coral ridge when Japanese tanks appeared. Type 97. Chiha medium tanks, 3 of them, advancing from the right flank with infantry following. The Marines had no anti-tank weapons immediately available. Someone called for naval gunfire, but communication was difficult. Radios damaged or lost in the landing. One tank turned its turret toward Martin's position, the short 75mm gun tracking. Martin pressed himself into the ground, expecting death. Then a Sherman tank from the 4th Tank Battalion rumbled up from the beach, its 75mm gun booming. The first shell hit the Japanese tank in the side, punched through the thin armor, exploded inside. The tank brewed up, flames erupting from every hatch. The other 2 Japanese tanks withdrew. The Marines pushed forward again. By mid-morning, the situation varied wildly across the 7 miles of landing beaches. In the north, the 4th Marine Division had landed 1,000 yards south of their intended beach due to strong currents. This accident proved fortunate, as they encountered lighter defenses than expected. In the center, the 2nd Marine Division faced intense resistance, struggling to gain any ground at all. In the south, Army troops landing later in the day found the beaches already chaotic. Wounded men awaiting evacuation, supplies piling up in disorder. Command and control was fragmented. Radio communications were spotty. Units became separated from their parent formations. Officers worked with whatever men they could find, organizing ad hoc assault teams to knock out bunkers and pillboxes. Martin spent the afternoon of June 15th in a nightmare of close-range fighting. His unit cleared bunkers one at a time, using flamethrowers, demolition charges, and grenades. Each bunker became a small battle. Marines would suppress the firing slits with rifle and machine gun fire, while a demolition team approached from the side or rear. A satchel charge would be placed. The team would run. The explosion would seal the bunker. Then they'd move to the next one. Some bunkers were empty, their defenders killed by the naval bombardment or withdrawn to other positions. Others were fully manned and fought to the death. By late afternoon, Martin's unit had advanced 500 yards from the beach. They had suffered 60% casualties. Martin himself had fired so many rounds that his rifle barrel was too hot to touch. As darkness approached on D-Day, the American beachhead was secure but shallow. 20,000 men were ashore, but penetration inland varied from 1,000 to 1,500 yards at most points. The original plan had called for capturing Oslido airfield on the first day. That objective was still 2 miles away. Japanese defenders still held commanding positions on Mount Tapochau and other heights, able to observe and fire on the entire American beachhead. As Marines dug foxholes and prepared defensive positions for the night, everyone knew what was coming. Japanese doctrine called for night counterattacks. The defenders would try to push the Americans back into the sea under cover of darkness. Martin dug his foxhole deep, checked his ammunition, and waited. The first day on Saipan had cost 2,000 American casualties, killed or wounded, and the battle had barely begun. The first wave had landed, had clawed out a foothold on the island, but Saipan's fortress was far from broken. The real test was still ahead. June 16th, 1944. Morning, Corporal Donald Haggerty moved cautiously up a ravine that would soon be known as Death Valley, though nobody had named it yet. The ravine was 500 yards long, narrow, with 50-foot ridges on both sides thick with vegetation. It looked like every other ravine on Saipan, which meant it looked like a perfect place to die. Haggerty's unit from the 6th Marines, 2nd Division, had been ordered to push inland toward Mount Tapochau, the 1,554-foot peak that dominated the island's interior. To reach the mountain, they had to cross this ravine. They made it about 50 yards before the Japanese opened fire. The defensive position was brilliant in its simplicity and lethality. Japanese machine guns and riflemen were dug into both ridges, creating a crossfire that covered every inch of the ravine floor. Mortars positioned behind the ridges could drop shells directly into the American line of advance. The Marines couldn't move forward without being cut down. They couldn't stay in place without being mortared. They couldn't retreat without exposing themselves to fire from behind. It was a perfect kill zone. Haggerty and his squad dove behind whatever cover they could find. Rocks, small rises in the ground, bodies of Marines who had already been hit. An officer called for air support, artillery support, tank support, anything. But coordination was difficult. Radio calls had to be relayed through multiple stations. Requests had to be approved. Time passed. Men died. The terrain of central Saipan transformed warfare into something primitive and brutal. Every hill, every ridge, every ravine became its own battlefield. Units lost contact with each other, separated by just a few hundred yards of impossible ground. The vegetation was thick enough to conceal defenders, but not thick enough to provide cover from bullets. The ground was a mixture of volcanic rock and coral, too hard to dig proper foxholes, perfect for Japanese forces who had spent months preparing positions. Mount Tapo Chau rose above everything, its slopes terraced with defensive positions, its caves packed with troops and supplies. From the mountain's heights, Japanese observers could see the entire American beachhead, directing artillery and mortar fire with devastating accuracy. Haggerty's squad finally exited Death Valley with the help of flamethrowers and tank support, but they had been in the ravine for 6 hours and had suffered 12 casualties out of 24 men. As they emerged from the southern end, a Marine with a flamethrower tried to clear a cave entrance. The man sprayed burning fuel into the cave mouth, and for a moment it seemed to work. Then a Japanese soldier emerged from a hidden side entrance, carrying a satchel charge. The soldier ran directly at the flamethrower operator and detonated the charge. Both men vanished in the explosion. Other Japanese soldiers emerged from the same cave, attacking with bayonets. A firefight broke out at point-blank range. When it was over, 14 Japanese soldiers were dead, and Haggerty's squad had lost 3 more men. The fighting style was unlike anything most Marines had experienced. At Tarawa, the battle had been intense but brief, 76 hours from landing to victory. At Guadalcanal, combat had been episodic, periods of intense fighting, separated by days of relative quiet. But Saipan was constant, grinding, unrelenting. Every day brought the same exhausting cycle. Wake at dawn, eat a cold breakfast from rations, check ammunition, move forward into terrain that favored defenders, fight for every yard of ground, dig in at night, repeat. There was no rear area, no safe zone. Japanese artillery could hit anywhere in the American beachhead. Infiltrators prowled at night, probing defensive lines. The physical and mental exhaustion accumulated day by day. On Purple Heart Ridge, so named because of the casualties it inflicted, Haggerty's unit took the same piece of ground 3 times on June 17th. Each time, they would fight their way up the slope, overwhelm the defenders, establish a position on top. Then night would fall, and Japanese infiltrators would attack from hidden tunnels and caves. The Marines would be forced back down the ridge. Morning would come, and they'd attack again. It was Sisyphean warfare, brutal and senseless. By the 3rd assault, Haggerty was so exhausted he could barely keep his eyes open. He had been in combat for 72 consecutive hours with almost no sleep. His hands shook uncontrollably. His uniform was stiff with dried blood, some his own, most from carrying wounded men. He had stopped thinking about anything except the next few yards of ground. The next bunker to clear, the next cave to attack. The cave warfare on Saipan forced innovation in real time. Standard infantry tactics were inadequate against defenders, who could disappear underground and reappear elsewhere. Marines developed new techniques, using smoke grenades to mark cave entrances for airstrikes, coordinating flamethrower teams with demolition specialists, employing tanks to seal caves with direct fire. But every cave was different. Some had multiple entrances. Some had interconnected tunnels that connected to other caves hundreds of yards away. Some were defended to the death, others abandoned before Marines arrived. There was no way to tell until you went in, and going in was terrifying. The darkness was absolute. The air was foul with cordite smoke and human waste. Defenders could be anywhere, around any corner, waiting in silence. At a medical aid station on the evening of June 18th, a Navy corpsman treated Haggerty for burns from a Japanese flamethrower. The enemy had hit Haggerty's squad with a Type 93 flamethrower, a weapon that sprayed burning liquid that stuck to skin and wouldn't stop burning. Haggerty's arm was covered with second-degree burns, the skin blistered and weeping. The corpsmen applied burn ointment and bandages, working quickly and efficiently. Around them, dozens of other wounded men waited for treatment. Some had minor wounds, others were dying. The corpsmen worked without stopping, treating one patient after another, occasionally pausing to smoke a cigarette with shaking hands. He had been treating casualties for 4 days straight. His uniform was covered in blood. His eyes were hollow with exhaustion. But he kept working. That night, June 18th, Haggerty sat in his foxhole, listening to Japanese infiltrators probing the perimeter. Sometimes the infiltrators would call out in English, taunting the Marines, trying to get them to reveal their positions. "Hey, Marine, where are you? Come out and fight." Haggerty ignored them, kept silent, watched the darkness. You never fired at night unless you saw a clear target. Muzzle flashes gave away your position. The infiltrators would move toward any flash and attack with grenades or bayonets. So the Marines waited in silence, straining to hear footsteps, trying to see shapes in the darkness. Occasionally a scream would ring out, someone finding an infiltrator or being found by one. Occasionally a firefight would erupt, brief and violent. Then silence would return. This was the rhythm of Saipan at night, long periods of tense waiting punctuated by moments of terror. The casualty rate during June 16th through 19th averaged 400 Marines killed or wounded per day. This attrition rate was unsustainable, but there was no choice except to continue. The beachhead had to be expanded, the high ground secured, the island conquered. The alternative, failure, withdrawal, defeat, was unthinkable. So the Marines pushed forward day after day, yard by yard, paying in blood for every foot of ground. Haggerty survived June 19th and saw June 20th dawn. He had been on Saipan for 5 days. It felt like 5 years. The island had become his entire world, a world reduced to earth and rock, blood and fire, exhaustion and fear. Mount Tapachao still loomed ahead, its slopes promising more of the same. More ravines, more bunkers, more caves, more death. The meat grinder was still grinding, and Haggerty, miraculously still alive, would keep moving forward because that was the only direction available. Behind him was the beach and the ocean. Ahead was Saipan's fortress, broken but not beaten, still capable of killing anyone who underestimated it. June 15th, 1944. Tokyo. Admiral Soemu Toyota received the first reports of American landings on Saipan just after dawn. He sat in his office at Combined Fleet Headquarters, reading the messages with mounting alarm. 8,000 Marines in the first wave, hundreds of ships offshore, massive naval bombardment still continuing. The Americans weren't just raiding Saipan. They were invading it with the clear intention of capturing and holding it. Toyota set down the messages and looked at the map on his wall, where pins marked Japanese bases and defensive positions across the Pacific. If Saipan fell, the inner defensive ring would be broken. The war would enter its final phase. Time was running out. That afternoon, Toyota was summoned to the Imperial Palace. Emperor Hirohito, normally a ceremonial figure who left military decisions to his generals and admirals, demanded a personal briefing on the Saipan situation. This was unprecedented. The emperor rarely involved himself directly in operational matters. But Saipan was different. If B-29 bombers reached Tokyo, the emperor himself would be in danger. The imperial palace could be destroyed. The symbolic center of Japan could be obliterated. Standing before the emperor in the palace's austere briefing room, Toyota explained the situation as honestly as he could. The Americans had landed in force. The garrison was fighting hard, but was outnumbered and outgunned. Reinforcement was impossible. The Americans controlled the sea and air around Saipan. The emperor listened in silence, then spoke. "Saipan must not fall," he said, "whatever the cost." Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding Japanese forces on Saipan, received the emperor's message on June 16th. "Hold at all costs. The empire depends on your success." Saito read the message in his headquarters cave, deep underground, lit by electric lights powered by a generator that coughed and wheezed with failing fuel. Around him, staff officers waited for his response. Saito was 64 years old, a career army officer who had served in China and Manchuria. He understood military reality. His garrison of 31,000 troops faced an American force that would eventually number 127,000. His soldiers were brave and well-trained, but they had no air support, no naval support, no possibility of reinforcement or resupply. They were alone on an island that the Americans were determined to take. Saito's response to the emperor was brief: "We will hold to the last man." But Saito was not the only Japanese commander on Saipan. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded naval ground forces and coastal defenses. This was an awkward command structure, a consequence of inter-service rivalry between Army and Navy. Nagumo was the man who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor, who had achieved Japan's greatest victory of the war. Now he was trapped on Saipan, commanding defense forces in a battle that couldn't be won. The irony was bitter. Nagumo and Saito coordinated as best they could, but they operated under different chains of command, received different orders, had different strategic perspectives. This divided command would hamper Japanese defensive operations throughout the battle. From the island of Tinian, just 3 miles south of Saipan, Japanese artillery batteries opened fire on the American beachhead. The guns were large-caliber pieces positioned in caves on Tinian's northern coast. They could reach across the channel and drop shells into the landing beaches. American ships tried to suppress these batteries with counter-battery fire, but the guns were well protected and continued firing intermittently throughout the battle. It was a small contribution to Saipan's defense, but it was all Tinian could provide. The garrison there had its own survival to consider, knowing that once Saipan fell, they would be next. Admiral Toyota, back in Tokyo, made a fateful decision. He ordered Operation A-Go into execution. This was Japan's plan for a decisive naval battle, the operation that would lure the American fleet into a trap and destroy it in one climactic engagement. The plan relied on land-based aircraft from the Marianas and Carolines, working with carrier-based aircraft to overwhelm American defenses. But the Americans had already captured or neutralized most of the land bases. The Japanese carriers would be largely on their own. Still, what choice did Toyota have? If he didn't commit the fleet now, Saipan would fall, and with it, Japan's ability to defend its inner empire. The combined fleet had to sail. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet that sortied from Philippine bases on June 16. Ozawa was an aggressive, confident officer who believed that Japanese tactical skill could overcome American material superiority. His fleet included 9 aircraft carriers with 473 aircraft. It was the largest carrier force Japan had assembled since Midway. But these aircraft and pilots were not what they had been. The best Japanese carrier pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the early war campaigns, were dead. Their replacements had far less training, often as little as 6 months of flight instruction compared to the 18 to 24 months that American pilots received. Japanese naval aviation was a shadow of its former self, but it was all Ozawa had. He steamed northeast from the Philippines toward the Marianas, planning to attack the American fleet from the west, while land-based aircraft hit from the east. It was a good plan. It just had no chance of succeeding. As Ozawa's fleet steamed toward battle, communication with Saipan became increasingly difficult. American aircraft had destroyed radio antennas and communications facilities. Messages took hours to reach headquarters, by which time the tactical situation had changed completely. General Saito found himself fighting a battle in near isolation, making decisions based on fragmentary information. Unable to receive meaningful guidance from Tokyo, he could see American forces expanding their beachhead, pushing inland, threatening to split his defenses. He had committed his reserves to counterattacks that achieved only temporary success before being driven back by American firepower. His casualties were mounting, and he had no way to replace losses. The Japanese civilian population on Saipan complicated Saito's defense. More than 25,000 Japanese colonists, men, women, and children, were trapped in the battle zone. Some had fled north as fighting approached. Others remained in caves near their former homes, hoping to survive until Japanese reinforcements arrived. Saito had issued orders to evacuate civilians from combat zones, but this was impossible to enforce in the chaos of battle. Japanese military culture emphasized that civilians must not fall into American hands. that capture was unacceptable. This ideology would later contribute to the battle's most horrific outcome. For now, the civilians were simply another complication in an already desperate situation. Admiral Nagumo, in his headquarters cave near Garapan, contemplated his situation on June 20th. He had gone from commanding 6 aircraft carriers and striking Pearl Harbor to defending a cave on a doomed island. His coastal defense guns had been silenced one by American naval gunfire. His troops were being pushed back daily. He could hear American artillery fire even in his deep underground headquarters. Outside, Garapan had been completely destroyed, every building leveled by the naval bombardment. Nagumo was 61 years old, a graduate of the Naval Academy in 1908, a man steeped in the traditions of Japanese military honor. He knew how this would end. There would be no reinforcements, no rescue. When the final moment came, he would do what tradition required, but not yet. First, he would fight. The Japanese understanding of Saipan's strategic importance made the battle uniquely desperate. This wasn't a remote atoll that could be yielded without critical consequences. This was the gateway to the homeland. If Saipan fell, American bombers would reach Tokyo. If American bombers reached Tokyo, Japanese civilians would experience the reality of total war. The government would face pressure to negotiate surrender. The military would lose its ability to control the war's narrative. For Japan's leadership, Saipan represented an existential threshold. Once crossed, there was no going back. This calculation, this desperate mathematics of distance and bombing range, meant that Saipan would be defended with a ferocity and determination that exceeded even Japanese military norms. Every soldier on Saipan understood that they were fighting for more than just another island. They were fighting for Japan itself, for their families in Tokyo and Osaka and Nagoya. This knowledge didn't make them more likely to win, but it made them vastly more dangerous to defeat. Admiral Toyoda's fleet was coming. General Saito's troops were fighting. Admiral Nagumo's coastal defenses were still firing. And in Tokyo, the Emperor was watching, waiting to see if his command to hold Saipan at all costs would be obeyed. The Empire was watching its defensive ring crack. Soon, it would break completely. June 16th, 1944, near Sharan Kanoa, Staff Sergeant Robert Neiman sat in the commander's position of his M4A2 Sherman tank, watching the terrain ahead through his periscope. The tank was buttoned up, all hatches closed, and the interior was suffocating. The temperature inside reached 130 degrees. Sweat dripped from every surface. The air smelled of gun oil, exhaust fumes, and unwashed men who had been living in this steel box for 36 hours. Neiman's crew consisted of 4 other men, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and an assistant driver who also operated the bow machine gun. They had trained together for 8 months. Now they were about to discover if that training was enough. Movement ahead. Neiman spotted it through his periscope, a low shape moving between buildings. Japanese tank. He keyed his intercom. Gunner, target tank, 11 o'clock, 50 yards. His gunner, a kid from Chicago named Morrison, swiveled the turret left. Through the gun sight, he acquired the target. A Type 95 Hago light tank, about 8 tons, mounting a 37mm gun. It looked like a toy compared to the Sherman's 33 tons and 75mm main gun, but toys could still kill you. The Japanese tank hadn't seen them yet. Morrison waited for the order. "Fire," Neiman said. The 75 boomed, the tank rocking with recoil. The armor-piercing round covered 50 yards in a fraction of a second, punched through the Hago's thin armor like paper, and exploded inside. The Japanese tank stopped moving. Smoke poured from its hatches. No one got out. The Sherman was designed to fight German panzers in Europe, where armor warfare meant tank duels across open fields, at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. But Saipan's terrain and Japanese armor doctrine created entirely different combat conditions. Japanese tanks were light, thin-skinned, designed primarily for infantry support rather than tank versus tank combat. Their armor could be penetrated by heavy machine gun fire at close range. Their main guns were adequate against infantry positions, but nearly useless against American medium tanks. In theory, this meant American tanks had overwhelming superiority. In practice, Saipan's terrain nullified many of these advantages. Jungle vegetation and broken ground reduced engagement ranges to yards instead of hundreds of yards. Japanese infantry armed with magnetic mines and satchel charges could approach American tanks from dead angles. And Japanese anti-tank guns, positioned in caves and bunkers, could ambush Shermans at point-blank range. Neiman's tank, callsign Charlie 15, moved forward cautiously through what had been Charon Kanoa's residential district. Nothing remained except rubble and shell craters. His driver, Private Kowalski, navigated around obstacles while watching for anti-tank ditches and traps. The Japanese had spent months preparing Saipan's defenses, and that included anti-tank measures. Some ditches were 15 feet deep, wide enough to trap a Sherman, camouflaged with vegetation and canvas to look like solid ground. A tank that fell into such a trap became a stationary target, unable to maneuver, easily destroyed. Kowalski had already seen one Sherman from another company sitting nose down in a ditch, its crew dead inside, 3 anti-tank rounds through the hull. The primary mission of tanks on Saipan wasn't fighting other tanks. It was supporting Marine infantry and attacking fortified positions. This meant moving with infantry teams, using the tank's firepower to suppress enemy bunkers while Marines maneuvered for assault. The coordination required was complex. Tanks and infantry communicated using a telephone mounted on the tank's rear, allowing infantrymen to talk directly to the tank commander. When the tank needed to move, infantry would provide covering fire. When infantry needed support, the tank would engage specific targets with its main gun or machine guns. This symbiotic relationship saved countless lives on both sides. Tanks provided firepower and mobile cover. Infantry protected tanks from close-range attacks. On the slopes of Mount Taipo Pale, Neiman's tank supported an assault on a cave system that had held up Marine advance for 6 hours. The cave mouth was 8 feet wide, positioned at the base of a cliff, with excellent fields of fire covering the approach. Marines had tried to reach it multiple times and been driven back by machine gun fire. Now, Neiman's Sherman rolled forward, bow machine gun and coaxial machine gun firing continuously at the cave mouth. Behind the tank, a squad of Marines advanced, using the Sherman as a moving shield. When Neiman was 50 feet from the cave, his gunner fired a high-explosive round directly into the opening. The explosion collapsed part of the cave entrance. Marines rushed forward with satchel charges and flamethrowers, clearing the position. 12 Japanese soldiers died inside. No Marines were lost. That was a good trade. But tanks died too. Company C of the 4th Tank Battalion started the battle with 17 Shermans. By June 20th, 8 had been knocked out, 4 beyond repair. Anti-tank guns killed most of them. Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns, positioned in caves with narrow firing ports, could ambush tanks from the side or rear where armor was thinnest. The first indication of danger would be a sharp crack and a tremendous impact as an armor-piercing round punched through steel. If the crew was lucky, the round would pass through without exploding, giving them seconds to bail out. If they were unlucky, the round would detonate inside the tank, turning the interior into a blast furnace that incinerated everyone. Tankers learned to read the terrain, avoiding obvious ambush sites, never advancing without infantry support, always keeping the thickest armor toward known enemy positions. Night defensive positions for tanks followed strict protocol. Neiman's Sherman would be positioned hull down behind a ridge or in a depression, turret able to traverse and fire, but hull protected. The engine would be left running, ready for immediate movement if Japanese infiltrators attacked with satchel charges or magnetic mines. The crew would sleep inside the tank, taking shifts on watch. It was miserable, claustrophobic, exhausting, but it was safer than sleeping outside. Japanese night infiltrators specifically targeted tanks, knowing that disable armor would make the next day's attack more difficult. Some mornings, Marine tankers would find magnetic mines attached to their hulls, placed during the night by infiltrators who had somehow approached within touching distance without being detected. It was psychological warfare as much as physical, the knowledge that the enemy could reach you even inside a tank. The most harrowing incident Neiman experienced occurred on June 18th. His tank encountered a Type 97 Chaiha medium tank in a narrow street in Garapan. Both tanks fired simultaneously at 30 yards range. The Japanese shell, a 75mm round, hit Neiman's Sherman on the glacis plate, the sloped frontal armor. The round deflected upward, screaming over the turret, and exploded against a building behind them. Neiman's return shot hit the Chiha dead center, penetrating the frontal armor and detonating the ammunition inside. The Japanese tank exploded with such force that the turret blew completely off, tumbling through the air. The crew tried to escape through the hole hatches. Neiman's bow gunner killed them with machine gun fire as they emerged. It was butchery, mechanical, and efficient. Neiman felt nothing. You couldn't afford feelings in a tank. White phosphorus rounds were among the most feared weapons in the tank arsenal. When a tank fired a white phosphorus shell at a Japanese position, the round would explode and scatter burning phosphorus that stuck to anything it touched and couldn't be extinguished with water. Japanese soldiers hit with white phosphorus would burn alive, running from their positions in agony. Neiman's tank used white phosphorus rounds against a bunker complex on June 19th. The effect was immediate and horrible. Soldiers emerged from the bunker, their uniforms burning, trying desperately to remove the phosphorus that was burning through their skin. Marine infantry shot them as they emerged. It was a mercy of a sort. Neiman watched through his periscope and felt sick. This was what armored warfare on Saipan had become. Not clashes between steel titans across open fields, but close-range slaughter in streets and jungles. Mechanical murder at ranges where you could see the faces of the men you were killing. By June 21st, the 4th Tank Battalion had lost 31 tanks to all causes, 24 to enemy action. But the battalion had also destroyed every Japanese tank on Saipan, eliminated hundreds of fortified positions, and saved countless Marine lives by providing mobile firepower exactly where it was needed. The Shermans would continue fighting until the island was secure, rolling forward each day, supporting infantry assaults, absorbing fire that would otherwise kill Marines. Neiman would survive the battle, his tank scarred by dozens of hits but still operational. Years later, asked about his experience on Saipan, he would struggle to explain what tank warfare in the Pacific was like. It wasn't glorious or heroic. It was industrial, mechanical, a business of steel and explosives conducted at ranges so close you could smell the enemy positions burning. The tanks were weapons, tools for killing, and Neiman and his crew had used their tool with brutal efficiency. That was their job. They had done it well. But the memories of burning men, exploding tanks, and the suffocating heat inside a steel box would stay with Neiman for the rest of his life. The Steel Titans had fought on Saipan. They had won. But victory in a tank was measured in destroyed targets and survived days, not in glory or honor. Those concepts didn't exist inside a Sherman. There was only the next target, the next threat, the next day to survive. June 24th, 1944, 10 o'clock at night. In a cave deep beneath Mount Tapochau, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito prepared to die. He sat on a camp stool in his underground command post, surrounded by staff officers who stood at attention in the flickering light of kerosene lanterns. The cave smelled of earth and explosives and unwashed men. Outside, the American forces had compressed Japanese defenses into the northern third of Saipan. The garrison that had numbered 31,000 3 weeks ago was now fewer than 10,000 effectives. Ammunition was running low. Food was nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were gone. Wounded men died in caves because there was no medicine to treat them. Saito had received a final message from Tokyo. "You have done your duty. Act as you see fit." It was permission to die. Saito stood and addressed his officers. His speech was brief, delivered in the formal Japanese military style. He thanked them for their service. He praised their courage. He acknowledged that the battle was lost, but insisted that their sacrifice had meaning, that they had delayed the American advance toward Japan, that their deaths would inspire future defenders. Then he gave his final order: a general assault, a last attack using every remaining soldier to inflict maximum casualties on the Americans before the garrison was annihilated. It would be the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. 4,300 men would attack at dawn. Almost none would survive. Saito bowed to his officers. They bowed back. Then he withdrew to his private chamber, where his aide waited with a samurai sword. Saito knelt, performed the ritual seppuku, cutting his abdomen. His aide delivered the final blow, decapitating him. Vice Admiral Nagumo, in another cave, committed suicide the same night. June 26, 1944. 4 o'clock in the morning. Private First Class. Frank Garcia of the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment, heard them before he saw them, chanting, singing. Hundreds of voices. Garcia was 22 years old, from New Mexico, part of the 27th Infantry Division, holding the center of the American line. His unit had been on Saipan for 10 days and had suffered steady casualties pushing inland. Now they held defensive positions across relatively flat terrain. Foxholes and machine gun nests spread across a front of 1,500 yards. Garcia peered into the darkness, trying to see the source of the sounds. Then the mist parted and he saw them coming. The attack came in waves, human waves, thousands of men charging across open ground directly at the American defensive positions. The first ranks were organized military formations, soldiers with rifles and bayonets attacking in coordinated units. Behind them came walking wounded from field hospitals. Bandaged men who could barely walk but carried rifles anyway. Behind them came soldiers armed with bayonets lashed to bamboo poles. Some attackers had no weapons at all, just grenades or knives. They came screaming, chanting, calling out the Emperor's name. Garcia opened fire with his M1 Garand rifle, firing as fast as he could load 8-round clips. Around him, every American weapon opened up. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, artillery. The noise was overwhelming, continuous. A roar of explosions and gunfire that seemed to shake the ground itself. The Japanese broke through the first line of American defenses within 30 minutes. The sheer mass of the attack overwhelmed the 105th Regiment's positions. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers poured through gaps in the line, overrunning foxholes, killing defenders with bayonets and swords. Garcia's foxhole was bypassed by the first wave, but the second wave came right at him. He shot a Japanese soldier at 5 yards, then another at 3 yards. A third soldier jumped into his foxhole, and they fought hand to hand, grappling for Garcia's rifle. Garcia won, managed to get the muzzle against the soldier's chest, and fired. Blood and tissue sprayed across the foxhole. Garcia climbed out, fell back 50 yards to a secondary position, started firing again. By 5:30 in the morning, Japanese soldiers had penetrated 1,500 yards into the American lines and reached the artillery positions. The 105th Regiment's supporting artillery battalion, equipped with 105mm howitzers, found themselves in direct combat. Artillerymen, trained to fire from miles behind the front lines, were suddenly fighting Japanese soldiers at their gun positions. They lowered the howitzers to point-blank range and fired high explosive shells directly into the attacking masses at zero elevation. The shells exploded among Japanese formations at ranges of 50 to 100 yards, creating carnage. Artillerymen fought with pistols, rifles, whatever weapons they could find. Some guns were overrun, their crews killed, before being retaken by counterattacking infantry. The combat devolved into dozens of individual battles, small units fighting desperately against overwhelming numbers. Garcia found himself in a group of 20 soldiers and Marines, mixed units that had lost contact with their parent organizations. They held a small rise, firing down at Japanese soldiers attacking from 3 directions. An officer Garcia didn't recognize organized the defense, positioning men to cover all approaches, consolidating ammunition from wounded and dead. They held for 3 hours, running low on ammunition, resorting to throwing rocks when bullets ran out, finally relieved by Marine reserves counterattacking from the south. 8 o'clock in the morning. The Banzai charge had spent itself. American reserves, Marine units pulled from other sectors, counterattacked across the broken ground. They retook the artillery positions, pushed back through the captured defensive lines, restored the front. The cost to both sides was staggering. 650 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing, the highest single-day loss for the U.S. Army on Saipan. Japanese losses were nearly total. 4,311 bodies were counted on the battlefield. An entire garrison had essentially committed suicide in a single attack. But unlike the stereotypical banzai charge of propaganda films, this attack had been sophisticated and nearly successful. It had exploited a weak point in the American line, achieved surprise, and come close to breaking through to rear area headquarters and supply dumps. Garcia survived, though he was wounded by shrapnel from a knee mortar round, a minor wound that earned him evacuation to an aid station. Sitting on a hospital ship later that day, being treated for his wounds, Garcia tried to process what he had experienced, the sheer scale of the attack. The willingness of thousands of men to charge into certain death was beyond his comprehension. American military culture emphasized survival, achieving objectives while minimizing casualties. Japanese military culture, at least as practiced on Saipan, seemed to embrace death as the objective itself. Garcia couldn't understand it. He didn't need to. All he knew was that 4,000 Japanese soldiers who might have defended northern Saipan for weeks in caves and bunkers had instead died in a single morning. The attack had failed. Japanese command structure on Saipan had collapsed with the suicides of Saito and Nagumo. Organized resistance was effectively over, but the attack had revealed something profound about the war in the Pacific. The Japanese garrison, facing certain defeat, had chosen to die attacking rather than surrender. Every man in that charge knew he was marching to his death. They charged anyway. This was the enemy that American forces would face in every subsequent battle, an enemy for whom surrender was literally unthinkable, for whom death in battle was preferable to capture. The implications were clear. If Saipan's garrison chose death over surrender, what would happen when American forces approached Japan itself? How many Japanese would die defending their homeland? These questions haunted American planners as they counted the bodies scattered across the battlefield, where the banzai charge had broken like a wave against American firepower. The aftermath of the charge was a scene from hell. Thousands of bodies lay in the open, bloating in the tropical heat. Burial details worked for days, but the numbers were overwhelming. Some bodies were bulldozed into mass graves, others were burned where they fell. The smell was indescribable, a stench of death that permeated everything, stuck to uniforms, invaded dreams. American soldiers who had fought in the charge's path were haunted by what they had seen. Wounded Japanese soldiers, some missing limbs, crawling forward still trying to attack. Soldiers attacking with bamboo spears when their rifles were empty. Men so weak from wounds they could barely walk, still advancing. The banzai charge on Saipan was the largest such attack of the Pacific War. It would not be the last, but it was the one that made American planners understand with absolute clarity that Japan would fight to extermination rather than surrender. The arithmetic of that realization was sobering. If 4,000 men could be convinced to die in a hopeless attack on Saipan, how many millions would die defending Japan? The banzai charge answered that question before it was asked. The answer was, all of them, every single one. June 19th, 1944, 10 o'clock in the morning, 100 miles west of Saipan. Lieutenant Alexander Vratiw stood on the flight deck of the USS Lexington, watching the catapult crew prepare his F-6F Hellcat for launch. Vratiw was 25 years old, from Chicago, already an ace with 12 confirmed kills. He was the executive officer of VF-16, one of the Navy's premier fighter squadrons. Around him, dozens of other Hellcats were being launched, catapulted from the carrier's deck into the morning sky. The Combat Information Center had detected a massive Japanese air raid approaching from the west. Over 300 aircraft, the largest carrier strike the Japanese had launched in more than a year. Vratiw's mission was simple: intercept and destroy as many as possible before they reached the American fleet. The battle that was about to unfold had been building for days. Admiral Ozawa's Japanese mobile fleet, 9 carriers with 473 aircraft, had been steaming toward the Marianas since June 16th. American submarines had detected the fleet on June 17th and shadowed it, radiating position reports. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American Fifth Fleet, faced a difficult decision. Should he steam west to meet the Japanese fleet, or should he stay near Saipan to protect the invasion force? Spruance chose to stay near Saipan, a decision that some of his more aggressive subordinates disagreed with, but that proved strategically sound. The Japanese would have to come to him. and they would have to attack across hundreds of miles of ocean while American carriers could launch and recover aircraft from relatively short distances. Vrasiu's Hellcat launched at 10:15, accelerating from 0 to 120 knots in 2 seconds as the catapult flung him off the deck. He climbed to 20,000 feet, joining a formation of other fighters from Task Force 58. The American carrier force was massive, 15 fleet and light carriers, over 900 aircraft. But would it be enough? Japanese pilots in the early war had been among the world's best, veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, highly trained and experienced. The Americans knew this history and approached the coming battle with respect for their opponent's skill. What they didn't know yet was that those skilled Japanese pilots were dead, killed over Guadalcanal and the Solomons and Rabaul. The pilots flying toward them now were hastily trained replacements with a fraction of the experience. At 10:30, Vrasiu's radar intercept officer called out the first contact. Bogies at 50 miles, closing fast. Vrasiu pushed his throttle forward and dove toward the incoming formation. Through broken clouds, he spotted them. Dozens of Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers in neat V formations heading for the American carriers. They looked professional, disciplined. But as Vrasiu approached, he realized something was wrong. The Japanese formations weren't taking evasive action. They were flying straight and level, maintaining formation, making themselves perfect targets. Vrasiu selected the trailing bomber in one formation, closed to 300 yards, and fired a burst from his .650 caliber machine guns. The Judy exploded, pieces tumbling through the sky. Vrasiu moved to the next target and fired again. Another explosion. What followed was less a dogfight than a slaughter. Vrasiu shot down 6 Judy dive bombers in 8 minutes, expending only 360 rounds of ammunition. All around him, other American pilots were achieving similar results. Japanese aircraft fell from the sky like burning leaves. The few that penetrated the fighter screen faced a wall of anti-aircraft fire from American ships. Radar-directed 5-inch guns that filled the sky with timed fused shells. By noon, the Japanese strike force had been effectively annihilated. 300 aircraft had attacked. Fewer than 40 would return to their carriers. American losses were 23 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents rather than combat. The battle earned its nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, from the lopsided nature of the aerial combat. But there was nothing sporting or easy about what the American pilots accomplished. They were simply better trained, flying better aircraft, supported by better technology. The F-6F Hellcat was specifically designed to fight the Japanese Zero. It was heavier, faster in a dive, more rugged, and more heavily armed. American pilots had learned to exploit these advantages, avoiding turning dogfights where the Zero's maneuverability gave it an edge, instead using boom and zoom tactics, diving from above, firing, and climbing away. Japanese pilots, many with less than 6 months of training, couldn't compete. While the air battle raged, American submarines were stalking Japanese carriers. The USS Albacore, commanded by Captain James Blanchard, achieved position ahead of the Japanese fleet and fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the carrier Taiho, Admiral Ozawa's flagship. One torpedo struck home, damaging the carrier's hull. The damage seemed minor. The ship maintained speed and continued flight operations. But the torpedo had ruptured aviation fuel lines, and gasoline vapors began accumulating in the lower decks. Damage control officers didn't recognize the danger. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the accumulated vapors found an ignition source. The carrier Taiho exploded from within, a massive detonation that blew out the sides of the hull. The ship capsized and sank within minutes, taking 1,650 men with it, including most of Admiral Ozawa's staff. The USS Kavala, another American submarine, torpedoed and sank the carrier Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major carrier battle of the war. 3 torpedoes struck the carrier's midsection, rupturing fuel tanks and igniting fires. 4 hours later, the fires reached the magazines. Shokaku exploded and sank, killing 1,200 men. In one day, the Japanese mobile fleet lost 3 carriers and over 600 aircraft. It was a catastrophe that eclipsed even Midway. At Midway, Japan had lost 4 carriers, but most of the pilots had been rescued. Here, most of the pilots were dead, killed in air combat or lost at sea when they just couldn't find their carriers in the darkness. The second day of battle, June 20th, brought further disaster for the Japanese. American carrier aircraft, launched late in the afternoon at extreme range, found the retreating Japanese fleet at sunset. In a desperate attack during the last light, American dive bombers and torpedo planes sank the carrier Hio and 2 oilers, damaged 4 other ships. The attack succeeded, but the return flight became an ordeal. American aircraft, low on fuel, tried to find their carriers in darkness. Many ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the carrier task force, made a controversial decision: turn on all the fleet's lights to guide aircraft home, despite the risk of submarine attack. The lights saved dozens of pilots. Even so, 80 aircraft were lost in the return flight, though most crews were rescued. Vrasiu landed on the Lexington after dark, his fuel gauge showing empty, and was met by excited intelligence officers who had already heard radio reports of his 6 kills. Vrasiu was exhausted, wrung out by hours of high-stress flying and combat, but he was also aware that something historically significant had happened. The Japanese carrier force, once the most powerful naval aviation force in the world, had been effectively destroyed in 2 days. Japan had lost 3 carriers sunk, 400-plus aircraft destroyed, 400-plus pilots killed. The losses were irreplaceable. Japanese naval aviation would never recover. The pilots who died on June 19th and 20th represented years of training and experience that couldn't be replaced in the war's remaining time. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, as it was officially named, was a decisive American victory that ensured Saipan's capture and broke Japanese naval power in the Pacific. But it was also controversial. Some American commanders, particularly Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, believed that Spruance should have been more aggressive, that the American fleet should have steamed west and destroyed the Japanese carriers before they could launch their strikes. This criticism would persist for decades after the war, but Spruance's caution had achieved its objective, protecting the Saipan invasion force while destroying Japanese carrier aviation. The turkey shoot had been one-sided because American advantages in training, technology, and numbers were overwhelming. For the Marines and soldiers fighting on Saipan, the naval victory meant that Japanese reinforcement was now impossible, that the garrison was truly isolated. It also meant that American forces could focus on grinding down the remaining defenders without worrying about naval attack. The battle in the air had been quick and decisive. The battle on the ground would continue for 3 more weeks, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan's last attempt to challenge American naval supremacy in the Pacific had failed catastrophically. The carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor were dead. The pilots who had terrorized the Pacific in 1941 and 42 were dead. Japanese naval aviation, for practical purposes, had ceased to exist as an offensive force. The turkey shoot had not just been a battle, it had been an execution, the final destruction of a force that had once seemed invincible. And it had happened in the skies over Saipan, while below, men fought and died on an island that now, absolutely and certainly, would fall to American forces. The only question remaining was how much blood the conquest would cost. July 7th, 1944. Marine Private Guy Gabaldon stood at the base of Marpy Point's cliffs, shouting in Japanese through a megaphone. Above him, 820 feet above, hundreds of Japanese civilians crowded the cliff's edge. Gabaldon was 18 years old, Mexican-American from Los Angeles. He had been raised by a Japanese-American family and spoke fluent Japanese. For the past 3 weeks, he had been using his language skills to convince Japanese soldiers and civilians to surrender, working alone or with small teams, often behind enemy lines. He had personally convinced over 800 people to give up. But what was happening at Marpy Point was beyond his power to stop. As he watched, people began jumping. The northern tip of Saipan had become the final refuge for thousands of Japanese civilians, as American forces compressed the remaining defenders into an ever-shrinking pocket. These civilians, colonists who had lived on Saipan for years or decades, faced a terrible dilemma. Japanese military propaganda had told them that Americans were barbarians who would torture and kill prisoners, who would rape women and murder children. This propaganda was believed. Many civilians had been shown fake photographs of American atrocities, heard fabricated stories of horror. They believed absolutely that capture meant a fate worse than death. The alternative, suicide, was presented as honorable, even patriotic. Die for the emperor rather than submit to capture. This psychological preparation, combined with the absolute certainty that they faced torture if captured, drove thousands of civilians to the cliffs. Shizuko Miura, a 32-year-old mother of 3, watched her neighbor throw her children off the cliff before jumping herself. Miura stood 20 feet away, holding her own children's hands, frozen in horror. She had come to Marpi Point because Japanese soldiers had told civilians that ships would arrive to evacuate them to Japan. No ships had come. Now soldiers were moving through the civilian crowds, encouraging suicide, sometimes enforcing it with threats. Miura saw a soldier hand grenades to a group of women, showing them how to activate the grenades and hold them to their bodies. The explosions killed 4 women instantly. Other soldiers were pushing people toward the cliff edge, physically forcing them to jump. Miura broke away from the crowd, hiding her children in a cave, refusing to die. Gabaldon watched the horror unfold from below, shouting uselessly through his megaphone. "The war is over! You won't be harmed! The Emperor wants you to live!" His words were drowned by the wind and the screams of falling people. Bodies tumbled from the cliff, hitting the rocks below or splashing into the ocean. Some people jumped alone. Others jumped in family groups holding hands. Children were thrown over before adults jumped. Elderly people who couldn't climb to the cliff edge were killed by relatives, mercy killings to save them from capture. In a few hours, approximately 1,000 people died at Marpi Point. It was the largest mass suicide event of the Pacific War. American forces watching from a distance were horrified and helpless. They had not expected this. Earlier in the battle, many Japanese civilians had surrendered, accepting food and medical care, adapting to captivity. But at Marpi Point, something different happened. The combination of isolation, propaganda, fear, and coercion created conditions for mass hysteria. People who might have surrendered individually were swept up in group psychology. If everyone around you is choosing death, if soldiers are telling you it's your duty, if you absolutely believe that capture means torture, the decision to jump becomes easier. The individual will to survive was overwhelmed by social and cultural pressure. After the immediate horror ended, Navy corpsmen and Marines worked to rescue survivors from the rocks below the cliffs. Many had survived the fall with horrific injuries, broken backs, shattered legs, crushed skulls. American medics treated these people with the same care they gave wounded Marines. Some survivors, regaining consciousness in American aid stations, were stunned to discover they weren't being tortured. They had been told Americans were monsters. Instead, they found young men giving them morphine for pain, setting broken bones, offering water and food. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Everything they had been told was lies. And they had watched their families die believing those lies. Gabaldon managed to convince one group of about 200 civilians to come down from the cliffs, using a combination of appeals to the emperor's name and promises of safety. He told them that the emperor wanted Japanese subjects to survive, that dying accomplished nothing, that their duty was to live and rebuild Japan. This approach, invoking the emperor's authority, was effective where other appeals failed. If surrender could be framed not as betrayal, but as obedience to the emperor, people would consider it. Gabaldon understood this instinctively. He was operating without orders, often without support, risking his life repeatedly to save people who saw him as the enemy. His actions would later earn him the Navy Cross, though he believed he deserved the Medal of Honor and fought for decades to receive it. The suicides at Marpi Point were part of a broader pattern of civilian deaths on Saipan. Approximately 10,000 Japanese civilians died during the battle, about 1,000 from suicide at the cliffs, others from combat, disease, starvation, or being caught in crossfire. Some were killed by Japanese soldiers who didn't want them to surrender. Some were killed by American fire when they couldn't be distinguished from combatants. Some died in caves that were sealed by flamethrowers or demolitions, unable to identify themselves as non-combatants. The civilian death toll on Saipan was unprecedented in the Pacific War and raised profound questions about the cost of island warfare. American military planners, reviewing reports from Marpi Point, understood that they were facing a new dimension of the Pacific War. Previous battles had involved Japanese soldiers fighting to the death. But Saipan showed that Japanese civilians would also choose death over capture, influenced by propaganda and cultural conditioning. What did this mean for the eventual invasion of Japan? If civilians on Saipan killed themselves rather than surrender, what would happen when American forces invaded the home islands? The estimates were chilling. Millions of civilian deaths seemed possible, even likely. This realization would later influence the decision to use atomic weapons. The calculation that invasion would cost more lives, Japanese and American, than any alternative. Shizuko Miura survived with her children, one of the few families from Marpi Point to remain intact. After the war, she would testify about what she witnessed, describing the combination of propaganda, fear, and coercion that drove people to the cliffs. Her testimony, and that of other survivors, revealed that many civilians didn't want to die but felt they had no choice. They believed the propaganda. They trusted the soldiers who told them to jump. They couldn't imagine that surrender was possible. Miura's survival and her willingness to describe what happened provided crucial evidence about the psychological warfare that made Saipan so costly in civilian lives. The cliffs at Marpi Point today are marked by memorials in Japanese, commemorating the dead. The site has become a place of pilgrimage for Japanese visitors, a reminder of one of the war's most tragic events. But the memorials don't fully capture what happened there. They speak of sacrifice and honor. They don't mention that some people were pushed, that soldiers enforced suicide with threats and violence, that propaganda lies killed as surely as bullets. The truth of Marpi Point is more complex and darker than any memorial can express. It was a place where military propaganda and cultural conditioning combined to create conditions for mass death, where ordinary people were convinced that suicide was preferable to mercy, where families died believing lies about the enemy who, in reality, would have saved them if given the chance. Marpi Point was tragedy in its purest form: unnecessary death, preventable death, a death caused not by military necessity, but by psychological warfare that convinced people to destroy themselves. The Marines who fought on Saipan faced many horrors, but few haunted them more than watching civilians jump from cliffs while they shouted uselessly for them to stop. That was a different kind of battle casualty, one that no amount of firepower or courage could prevent. And it was, perhaps, the most disturbing revelation of the entire campaign, that the enemy American forces faced wasn't just Japanese military might, but a culture and propaganda system that could convince entire populations to choose death over survival. June 24th, 1944. War correspondent Robert Sherrod stood outside V Amphibious Corps headquarters, watching a confrontation that would become the most controversial command decision of the Pacific War. Inside the tent, Marine Lieutenant General Holland "Howlin' Mad" Smith was locked in heated argument with his staff about the performance of the Army's 27th Infantry Division. Sherrod couldn't hear the specific words, but Smith's nickname wasn't ironic. The Marine general's voice carried through the canvas, angry and insistent. Something was about to happen, and Sherrod, who had covered Pacific operations since Tarawa, recognized the tension. This wasn't routine military disagreement. This was personal. The 27th Division, a National Guard unit from New York, had been fighting on Saipan since June 16. They were positioned in the center of the American line, between the 2nd Marine Division on the left and the 4th Marine Division on the right. This positioning created a 3-division front pushing north across the island, but Holland Smith believed the Army division was moving too slowly, creating a salient in the American line where the faster-moving Marine divisions advanced while the 27th lagged behind. Smith saw this as unacceptable, dangerous, a failure of aggressive leadership. The exposed flanks of the Marine divisions faced enfilading fire from Japanese positions that should have been cleared by the Army. Marines were dying, Smith believed, because Army soldiers weren't pushing hard enough. Major General Ralph Smith, commanding the 27th Division, saw things differently. Ralph Smith was no relation to Holland Smith except in name, and their military philosophies couldn't have been more different. Ralph Smith believed in methodical, careful advance, clearing every position thoroughly before moving forward, minimizing casualties through caution. Holland Smith believed in aggressive momentum, accepting casualties to maintain pressure on the enemy, never giving defenders time to regroup. These philosophies reflected deeper institutional differences between Army and Marine Corps cultures. Marines prided themselves on offensive spirit, rapid movement, achieving objectives regardless of cost. The Army, with its larger formations and different strategic role, emphasized sustainability and preservation of combat power. The specific point of contention was Nafutan Point, a rugged peninsula on Saipan's southern coast. Holland Smith had assigned the 27th Division's 106th Regiment to clear Nafutan Point in a day, considering it a secondary objective. But the regiment had been fighting there for 3 days and still hadn't secured the area. Japanese defenders, about 500 men in caves and bunkers, had fought with typical tenacity. The 106th had suffered significant casualties and hadn't completed the mission. Holland Smith saw this as proof of inadequate leadership. Ralph Smith saw it as proof that Marine commanders didn't understand the difficulty of the terrain and the strength of defenses. On June 24th evening, Holland Smith made his decision. He drafted an order relieving Ralph Smith of command of the 27th Division, replacing him with Major General Sanderford Jarman, the garrison commander of captured Eniwetok Atoll. The relief was unprecedented. Never before had a Marine general relieved an Army general in combat. The institutional implications were enormous. Holland Smith justified his decision on tactical grounds. The 27th Division's slow advance endangered Marine divisions and jeopardized the entire operation. But Army officers saw it as inter-service rivalry, a Marine general scapegoating an Army commander for problems that affected all units equally. Ralph Smith received the relief order on June 25 and responded with quiet dignity. He gathered his staff, informed them that he was being relieved, expressed confidence in their abilities, and departed Saipan without protest. His professionalism under humiliating circumstances impressed even critics. But within the 27th Division, morale plummeted. Soldiers felt that their general had been unjustly blamed for difficulties that every unit faced. They had fought as hard as anyone, suffered similar casualties, faced the same enemy. Now they were being labeled as inadequate by Marine commanders who, in their view, understood publicity better than they understood ground combat. The controversy immediately spilled into the press. Correspondents like Sherrod, who had accompanied the 27th Division and the Marine divisions, filed stories about the relief. Some supported Holland Smith, arguing that the Marine general had made a tough but necessary decision. Others defended Ralph Smith, pointing out that casualty rates among all divisions were similar, that the 27th Division had performed well at Makin and Eniwetok, that the relief was unwarranted. The debate became national news, covered in papers across America, discussed in Congress. It became symbolic of larger questions about inter-service cooperation, command authority, and combat leadership. The statistics told a complicated story. From June 15 to June 24, the 27th Division suffered approximately 1,900 casualties killed, wounded, or missing. The 2nd Marine Division suffered approximately 3,800 casualties in the same period. The 4th Marine Division suffered approximately 3,300. On a per-day basis, accounting for different commitment dates, the casualty rates were roughly similar. The 27th Division's progress measured in yards per day was slower than the Marine divisions, but the terrain each division faced varied significantly. The Army Division fought through the island's center, arguably the most difficult terrain, against well-prepared defenses. A purely statistical analysis didn't clearly support Holland Smith's accusations of inadequate performance, but command decisions aren't made purely on statistics. Holland Smith believed, based on his experience and judgment, that Ralph Smith's leadership was insufficiently aggressive. Whether this belief was accurate is debatable. What's undeniable is that the relief damaged Army-Marine relations for the remainder of the war. Army commanders resented what they saw as Marine arrogance and scapegoating. Marine commanders felt vindicated when the 27th Division, under new leadership, advanced more rapidly in subsequent days, though this may have reflected improving tactical situations rather than leadership changes. The controversy led to congressional hearings after the war, investigations into command relationships, and lasting institutional resentment. For the soldiers of the 27th Division still fighting on Saipan, the relief of their commander was personal. They felt betrayed by higher command, sacrificed to inter-service politics. Yet they continued fighting, taking objectives, suffering casualties, doing their jobs. The professionalism of the rank and file, continuing to fight effectively despite feeling wronged, reflected credit on the division. They cleared northern Saipan alongside the Marine divisions, participated in the final push to the island's northern cliffs, and helped secure victory. Their performance after Ralph Smith's relief was indistinguishable from before, suggesting that the problem, if it existed, wasn't at the division level, but in the relationship between commanders. The Smith versus Smith controversy revealed fault lines in the American military, that the urgency of war had papered over, but not resolved. Different services had different cultures, different operational philosophies, different definitions of acceptable risk. These differences were manageable when services operated independently. But in joint operations like Saipan, where Army and Marine units fought side by side under unified command, these differences created friction. Holland Smith's relief of Ralph Smith brought that friction into the open, forced institutions to confront questions about command authority across service lines, and left bitter feelings that persisted long after the battle ended. Whether the relief was justified depends on whether you prioritize aggressive momentum or careful advance, offensive spirit or casualty conservation, Marine or Army institutional values. There was no objectively correct answer. There were only different philosophies about how to fight wars and different judgments about which philosophy was better suited to Saipan's brutal reality. The controversy ensured that Smith versus Smith would be remembered not just as a command decision, but as a symbol of inter-service rivalry, a reminder that even on the same battlefield, fighting the same enemy, American forces could disagree profoundly about how war should be waged. July 1st, 1944. Mount Tapachau's northern slopes. Corporal Howard Neese lay flat on volcanic rock, staring at a cave entrance 30 feet away. The entrance was maybe 4 feet high, dark as pitch, silent. Neese was a demolition specialist with the 25th Marines, 4th Division. His job was destroying caves, sealing positions, eliminating holdouts. He had been doing this job for 2 weeks and had learned to hate it. Cave work was intimate, terrifying, unpredictable. You never knew what waited in the darkness. Sometimes caves were empty. Sometimes they held wounded Japanese soldiers who would surrender. Sometimes they held defenders who would fight to the death. You didn't know until you went in or forced them out. And forcing them out meant getting close enough to be killed. The cave system on Tapachau was the most complex Neese had encountered. Preliminary reconnaissance suggested the caves were interconnected, tunnels linking multiple entrances across hundreds of yards. Japanese engineers had spent months carving these positions from solid rock, creating underground fortresses with firing positions, command posts, hospitals, storage chambers. Some chambers were large enough to hold 300 people. The tunnels had electrical lighting powered by generators, ventilation shafts to keep air fresh, blast doors to seal off sections. This wasn't improvised defense. This was systematic military engineering, designed to withstand siege, to allow defenders to move unseen underground while attacking from multiple surface positions. Destroying such a system required patience, coordination, and courage bordering on madness. Neese's team consisted of 4 men, himself, a flamethrower operator named Davis, and 2 riflemen for security. Their technique had been developed through brutal trial and error. First, the rifleman would approach the cave entrance and call out in Japanese, telling any occupants to surrender. If no response came, or if the response was gunfire, Davis would advance and spray flamethrower fuel into the cave mouth. The burning liquid would either kill the defenders or drive them out. If that didn't work, Neese would place demolition charges, trying to collapse the entrance. But collapsing entrances didn't always work. The caves had multiple openings, seal one, and defenders could escape through others or keep fighting from inside. The only sure method was going in, clearing each chamber, making sure no one was left alive to emerge later and attack from behind. On July 1st, Neese's team tried a new approach. They lowered a 40-pound satchel charge on a rope into the cave entrance, paying out line until the charge was deep inside. Then they detonated it. The explosion created a blast wave that roared out of the cave mouth, followed by smoke and dust. They waited for the air to clear, then sent Davis in with the flamethrower. Davis disappeared into the darkness, his flamethrower's pilot light making a small blue glow. Seconds passed. Then a whoosh as Davis fired, orange light flooding out of the cave. Davis emerged, shook his head. "It goes back deep," he said. "Maybe 50 yards. I saw bunks, equipment, but no people. They're in there somewhere." The team called for more support. A sergeant arrived with 4 more riflemen and a Korean-American interpreter. The interpreter, speaking Japanese, called into the cave, offering surrender. A voice responded from the darkness, shouting defiance. The voice said the Emperor would never forgive surrender, that Americans were barbarians, that death in battle was honorable. The interpreter kept talking, patient and calm, explaining that the war was lost, that surrender meant life, that the Emperor wanted his soldiers to survive. The conversation continued for 30 minutes. Finally, 5 Japanese soldiers emerged from the cave, hands raised, blinking in sunlight. Behind them came 43 civilians, including women and children. They had been hiding in the cave for 2 weeks, living on stored rice and rainwater, terrified of both the battle outside and the soldiers who wouldn't let them leave. But not every cave negotiation ended peacefully. Later that day, Nice's team encountered a cave that was booby-trapped. Someone had rigged a 500-pound bomb to a tripwire across the entrance. A Marine rifleman stepped on the wire. The explosion killed him and 2 others instantly, wounded 4 more, and created a crater 20 feet across. After that, the team approached every cave expecting traps. They used grappling hooks to trigger wires from a distance. They threw rocks into cave mouths to detonate pressure-sensitive explosives. They fired shots into the darkness before entering, hoping to detonate any charges. The work became slower, more methodical, even more dangerous. And there were so many caves, hundreds of them, scattered across Tapachau's slopes, each requiring clearance. The flamethrower was the most effective weapon for cave clearing, but also the most dangerous to operate. Davis's M22 flamethrower carried 4 gallons of napalm-thickened gasoline under compressed nitrogen pressure. The fuel would spray 40 to 50 yards, igniting on contact with air, sticking to whatever it hit. It was hideously effective against personnel. But the tanks on the operator's back were vulnerable. A bullet that punctured the tanks would turn the operator into a human torch. Davis had already been wounded once by a bullet that grazed his tank without penetrating. He kept operating the flamethrower because, he said, someone had to do it, and he was good at it. His arms were scarred from backsplash, burns from the fuel that sprayed back when firing at close range. He treated the scars as job requirements. Some caves couldn't be cleared and had to be sealed. When a cave was too deep, too complex, or too well defended, engineers would use bulldozers and explosives to collapse the entrance, burying everyone inside. This felt like murder to the men doing it, even knowing that the people inside were enemy combatants. They would call into the cave, offering surrender one last time. If no response came, or if the response was gunfire, the bulldozers would push tons of rock over the entrance, sealing it permanently. Sometimes the ground would shake from explosions inside as the entombed soldiers detonated their own ammunition, committing suicide rather than suffocating. These sealed caves became tombs, marked on maps, but never opened. Years later, some would be excavated, revealing skeletons still in fighting positions, rifles ready, waiting for enemies who never came. By July 9th, when the island was declared secure, approximately 1,000 caves had been identified and processed, but dozens, maybe hundreds more remained hidden. Japanese soldiers and civilians who refused to surrender would emerge from these caves weeks, months, even years later. Some were discovered by construction crews building American bases. Some emerged voluntarily, unable to survive any longer. Some attacked American patrols and were killed. The cave system on Saipan became a long-term security problem, requiring constant patrols and vigilance even after organized resistance ended. The island was conquered, but it wasn't pacified. It remained dangerous, infiltrated by holdouts who would kill if given the chance. Corporal Nice survived Saipan with minor wounds and was transferred to the assault on Tinian, where he would clear more caves. Years later, asked about his experience, he struggled to convey what cave warfare felt like. "It was like being a coal miner," he said, "except the coal shoots back. The darkness, the confined spaces, the constant possibility of death from any direction. It wore men down psychologically faster than open combat. At least in open combat, you could see the enemy, could judge distance and threat. In caves, you were blind, working by feel and instinct, never sure if the next step would trigger a trap or lead you into an ambush. It was warfare at its most primitive and most modern, simultaneously. Using explosives and flamethrowers, but fighting hand-to-hand in darkness, killing at arm's length. The cave war on Saipan taught lessons that would apply to every subsequent Pacific battle. Caves couldn't be bypassed. They had to be cleared, sealed, or occupied. Leaving caves behind meant leaving enemies behind, free to attack your rear or emerge after you'd passed. The only solution was systematic destruction, cave by cave, yard by yard, until every position was neutralized. It was slow, costly, brutal work, but it was necessary. And men like Nice and Davis did it day after day, descending into darkness to bring light, however harsh and final that light might be. July 10th, 1944, 4th Marine Division Cemetery. Chaplain Ernest Fenton stood before 200 fresh graves, conducting a mass burial service. The graves were arranged in neat rows on a hillside overlooking the ocean. Each grave was marked with a simple wooden cross, or Star of David, the Marine's name and serial number written in black ink. 200 men in this cemetery alone. There were 3 other cemeteries on Saipan, each with hundreds more graves, and bodies were still being recovered, pulled from caves, collected from battlefields, identified when possible, buried when identification failed. The mathematics of death on Saipan was overwhelming. Fenton read from the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, the same service he had conducted dozens of times over the past month. The words offered comfort, but they couldn't explain why these men had died here, on this island, in this war. The final casualty count for Saipan was catastrophic by any measure. 3,426 Americans killed, 13,099 wounded, 326 missing, most presumed dead in circumstances where bodies couldn't be recovered. The total, 16,851 casualties. This exceeded the total American casualties for all previous Pacific Island operations combined. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Makin, all the bloody fights of 1943 and early 1944 had cost fewer lives than Saipan alone. The battle had lasted 25 days, June 15 to July 9, meaning American forces suffered an average of 674 casualties per day. Every day, the equivalent of an entire infantry battalion was killed or wounded. The arithmetic was unsustainable. If every subsequent island cost proportional casualties, the war would never reach Japan. Japanese casualties were even more staggering, though exact numbers remained uncertain. Approximately 29,000 Japanese military personnel were killed, almost the entire garrison. Another 1,500 were captured, most in the final days when organized resistance collapsed. But these numbers didn't include the 10,000 or more civilians who died, bringing total Japanese deaths to nearly 40,000. The casualty ratio was approximately 4.5 Japanese deaths for every American death. This ratio would be cited by planners as evidence that the strategy of attrition was working, that American forces could systematically destroy Japanese military power through repeated island campaigns. But the ratio ignored a crucial fact. Japan had far more soldiers to expend than America had tolerance for casualties. At the casualty clearing station on the beach, Navy surgeons worked around the clock during the battle's peak. Commander Richard Marston, a surgeon from Philadelphia, later estimated that he performed 360 operations during the Saipan campaign. Some were simple, removing shrapnel, treating burns, setting broken bones. Others were desperately complex, attempting to save men with abdominal wounds, chest wounds, traumatic amputations. Marston and his team developed techniques on the fly, learning what worked and what didn't, trying to save as many as possible. The wounded-to-killed ratio on Saipan was 3.8 to 1, meaning for every man killed, nearly 4 more were wounded but survived. This ratio reflected advances in combat medicine, better training for corpsmen, faster evacuation to aid stations, the availability of blood plasma for transfusions, antibiotics to prevent infection. Men who would have died in previous wars survived, though many left Saipan permanently disabled. In Washington, D.C., War Department analysts reviewed Saipan's casualty figures with alarm. If Saipan cost 16,851 casualties, what would Tinian cost? Guam, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and ultimately, Japan itself. The analysts created projections based on Saipan's casualty rates, adjusted for the size of target islands and estimated garrison strengths. The projections were horrifying. Invading Japan's home islands, defended by millions of soldiers and civilians, could cost 500,000 to 1 million American casualties. These projections remained theoretical in July 1944, but they haunted planners, informing strategic decisions, contributing to debates about whether alternatives to invasion existed. The atomic bomb, still being developed in secret, would eventually be seen as such an alternative. But in July 1944, the only known path to victory led through more Saipans, more slaughter, more mathematics of acceptable loss. Fleet Hospital Ship Solace, anchored off Saipan, became a floating trauma center. The ship's surgeons operated continuously during the battle's height, sometimes conducting 50 surgeries per day. Operating rooms that normally ran 8 hours per shift ran 24 hours. Surgeons sleeping in chairs between cases, waking to perform another operation, then sleeping again. Navy Lieutenant Commander James Walsh later described performing surgery for 36 consecutive hours during June 17 and 18, operating on men with wounds he had never imagined, faces destroyed by machine gun fire, limbs shattered by artillery, burns covering entire bodies. Some men died during surgery, their wounds too severe for even immediate medical care to save them. Others survived only to die days later from infection or shock. Walsh described feeling numb by the end of the battle, emotionally exhausted, unable to feel anything except grim determination to save the next patient. The psychological casualties from Saipan, while harder to quantify, were significant. Combat fatigue, what later wars would call PTSD, affected thousands of men who were physically unwounded, men who had fought through the entire campaign, witnessing friends die, killing enemies at close range, living in constant fear, developed symptoms, nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, inability to feel anything. Some broke down completely, becoming non-functional, requiring evacuation and psychiatric care. Others continued functioning, but were permanently changed, their personalities altered by what they had experienced. The military had limited understanding of psychological trauma in 1944. Men were expected to remain functional regardless of stress. Those who couldn't were often labeled as cowards or malingerers, adding shame to trauma. The cost of Saipan extended beyond immediate casualties to long-term disability. Thousands of men left the island with wounds that would affect them for life: amputations, blindness, facial disfigurement, chronic pain from poorly healed bones. The Veterans Administration would deal with Saipan's wounded for decades. Some men adapted to disability, finding new careers, living fulfilling lives. Others never adapted, struggling with physical limitations and psychological trauma, unable to escape the memory of what happened on Saipan. The true cost of the battle couldn't be measured just by counting bodies in cemeteries. It had to include decades of suffering, lives permanently altered, families changed by the absence or disability of fathers and sons. As commanders reviewed Saipan's aftermath, they drew tactical lessons. Naval bombardment, while impressive, couldn't destroy underground fortifications. More emphasis needed to be placed on flamethrowers, demolitions, and close assault tactics. Tank infantry coordination needed improvement. Air support needed better communication with ground forces. These lessons would be incorporated into planning for subsequent operations. But the fundamental lesson was grimmer. Japanese forces would fight to annihilation, Civilians would choose death over surrender, and every island would cost thousands of American lives. There was no easy way to win the Pacific War. There was only the hard way. Systematic destruction of Japanese military power, island by island, killing tens of thousands of enemy soldiers while accepting thousands of friendly casualties. Saipan proved this arithmetic conclusively. Chaplain Fenton finished his service at the 4th Marine Division Cemetery and walked among the graves, reading names. He had known some of these men, had spoken with them days before they died. Others were strangers, just names on crosses. Fenton wondered if the families back home understood what had happened here, if they comprehended the scale of sacrifice their sons and brothers had made. Probably not. How could they? The battle had been reported in newspapers, certainly, but numbers and official reports couldn't convey the reality, the smell of death that covered the island, the screaming of wounded men, the sight of Marines burning Japanese soldiers out of caves, the horror of watching civilians jump from cliffs. These things couldn't be communicated. They could only be experienced, and experiencing them changed you. Fenton had conducted hundreds of burial services during the war. Each one took something from him, chipped away at his faith, left him questioning whether God had abandoned this island or whether humans had abandoned God. He had no answers. He only had services to conduct, prayers to read, comfort to offer to men who face their own mortality every day. The price of victory on Saipan had been paid in full, in blood and suffering and death. Whether that price was worth paying depended on whether you believed the alternative, allowing Japan to continue its conquests, was worse. Fenton believed it was. But on days like this, standing among hundreds of graves, he struggled to maintain that belief. The price had been so high, and there were so many more islands yet to take, so many more services to conduct, so many more graves to dig. The victory was real, but the price was almost unbearable. July 11th, 1944. Aslito Airfield. Chief Petty Officer James Garretson stood on a captured Japanese runway, watching a C-47 transport plane approach for landing. The plane's wheels touched down, bouncing once on the coral surface, then rolling to a stop. It was the first American aircraft to land on Saipan. Around Garretson, his CB construction battalion cheered. They had been working on this airfield for exactly 2 days, clearing wreckage, filling bomb craters, extending runways. The battle was technically still ongoing. Sporadic gunfire echoed from the hills, but the airfield was operational. The transformation of Saipan from battlefield to air base had begun even before the last shots were fired. This was the entire point of the campaign, not just to capture the island, but to turn it into a platform for destroying Japan. The CBs, officially the Naval Construction Battalions, were unique military units, combat engineers who could build anything anywhere under any conditions. Garretson's battalion consisted of men with civilian construction experience, heavy equipment operators, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, engineers. They were older than typical combat troops, averaging 31 years old, many married with families back home. They had enlisted not to fight, but to build. Though on Saipan the distinction between combat and construction was often meaningless. CBs worked under fire, operated bulldozers while being shot at, built airstrips on battlefields where bodies still littered the ground. Their motto was, "Can do," and they meant it literally. No job was impossible, no conditions too difficult, no timeline too compressed. The Japanese had built Aslito Airfield before the war, a modest facility with 2 runways designed for fighter aircraft. The American plan called for transforming it into a heavy bomber base capable of handling B-29 superfortresses. This required runways 8,500 feet long, 200 feet wide, constructed from crushed coral and concrete to support aircraft weighing 70,000 pounds fully loaded. It required extensive grading, drainage systems, fuel storage facilities, ammunition bunkers, maintenance hangars, control towers, and housing for thousands of personnel, and it had to be done quickly. B-29s were already being deployed to the Pacific, awaiting bases within range of Japan. Saipan would provide those bases, but only if the CBs could build them fast enough. Garrison's battalion worked 20-hour days, using every piece of construction equipment that could be landed on Saipan's beaches. Bulldozers scraped the island's surface, removing vegetation and topsoil, exposing the coral base layer. Graders leveled the surface to precise specifications, creating the flat and stable foundation required for runways. Dump trucks hauled millions of cubic yards of material, coral from inland quarries to the airfield site. Steamrollers compacted the coral into a solid surface. Concrete mixers worked continuously, pouring foundations for buildings and hard stands. The scale of construction was industrial, transforming Saipan's landscape at a rate that seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't seen Seabees work. On August 15, 1944, 2 months after D-Day, a massive explosion shook the island. Seabees had discovered a hidden Japanese ammunition dump near the airfield construction site, containing hundreds of tons of shells, bombs, and explosives. Rather than attempt to move the ammunition, they decided to detonate it in place. The explosion created a crater 80 feet deep and 300 feet across, sent a mushroom cloud thousands of feet into the air, and was felt on Tinian, 3 miles away. The blast broke windows in buildings miles from the explosion site and rained debris across half the island, but it eliminated the ammunition dump completely, allowing construction to continue. The incident became legendary among Seabees, the largest deliberate detonation in the Pacific War until the atomic bombs. By October 12, 1944, the first B-29 superfortress landed on Saipan. The aircraft, named Joltin Josie, was enormous compared to anything that had landed on Saipan before. 100 feet long, wingspan 141 feet, weighing 35 tons empty. Garrison watched it approach, marveling at the size. The B-29 represented everything the Saipan campaign had been fought for: the ability to strike Japan from the air, to bring the war to the enemy's homeland, to make Japan feel the destruction it had inflicted on others. As Joltin Josie taxied to a hard stand, Garrison felt a sense of accomplishment. His battalion had built this base from raw coral and determination. Now it would be used to win the war. The transformation accelerated through late 1944. Eventually, Saipan and adjacent Tinian would host 5 major airfields with over 700 B-29s. The islands became the largest airbase complex in the Pacific, supporting not just bombers but also fighters, transports, reconnaissance aircraft. Tens of thousands of personnel were stationed there: pilots, mechanics, bomb loaders, fuel handlers, cooks, clerks, medics. The islands that had been battlefields became cities, complete with roads, utilities, recreation facilities, hospitals, supply depots. The construction required moving over 3 million cubic yards of earth and coral in 4 months. It was one of the largest and fastest military construction projects of World War II. November 24, 1944. 111 B-29 superfortresses took off from Saipan and Tinian, bound for Tokyo. It was the first major raid on the Japanese capital since Doolittle's carrier-launched raid in April 1942. The bombers flew at high altitude, 30,000 feet, above the range of most Japanese interceptors. They dropped bombs on aircraft factories and industrial facilities. The damage was modest. High-altitude precision bombing proved difficult, but the psychological impact was enormous. Japan's capital, previously safe behind thousands of miles of ocean, was now under attack. And this was just the beginning. The raids would continue, would intensify, would eventually destroy most of Japan's major cities. Garrison watched the bombers take off, one after another, a procession of massive aircraft rolling down the runway he had helped build. Each bomber required thousands of gallons of fuel, tons of bombs, dozens of maintenance hours. The logistical complexity of operating 700 B-29s from Saipan was staggering. Every gallon of fuel had to be shipped from America or Pacific bases. Every bomb had to be transported across thousands of miles of ocean. Every spare part, every tool, every meal for the air crews had to be supplied through a chain that stretched across the Pacific. The Seabees had built the airfields. Now the rest of the military had to sustain operations from them. It was a demonstration of American industrial and logistical capability that Japan simply couldn't match. But even as the airfields became operational, Saipan remained dangerous. Japanese holdouts still hid in caves, occasionally emerging to attack construction crews or supply convoys. Patrols discovered Japanese soldiers who had been living in the jungle for months, surviving on stolen supplies and whatever they could scavenge. Some of these holdouts surrendered when confronted. Others attacked and were killed. The island's security required constant vigilance, patrols, and sweeps through areas that had supposedly been cleared. The cave systems made Saipan nearly impossible to fully secure. There were always more caves, more hiding places, more locations where enemy soldiers could survive for months or years. The strategic transformation was complete by early 1945. Saipan had gone from Japanese fortress to American air base in less than a year. The airfields built on Saipan's coral would launch 50,000 sorties by war's end, dropping 104,000 tons of bombs on Japan. The island that had cost 16,851 American casualties had been turned into a weapon aimed at Japan's heart. Every B-29 that took off from Saipan carried the purpose for which those casualties had been suffered. Every bomb dropped on Tokyo, Osaka, or Nagoya justified the battle's cost in the strategic calculus of total war. Whether this justification was sufficient depended on your perspective. If you believed that shortening the war through strategic bombing saved lives overall, then Saipan's price was worth paying. If you questioned whether strategic bombing actually shortened the war, or simply killed civilians while prolonging resistance, then Saipan's price seemed excessive. These debates would continue long after the last B-29 returned from Japan, long after the war ended, long after the airfields fell silent. But on Saipan in late 1944, as bombers took off daily to strike Japan, the Seabees who had built the runways felt pride in their achievement. They had turned coral and rock into instruments of war. They had built the bases from which Japan would be defeated. And they had done it with the speed and efficiency that made the Seabees legendary. Can do wasn't just a motto, it was a promise, and they had kept it. July 15th, 1944. Mount Tapochau. Captain Sakai Oba gathered the survivors around him in a cave on the mountain's northern slope. Oba was 31 years old, a career army officer who had fought in Manchuria before being assigned to Saipan. He commanded approximately 46 soldiers, all that remained of his company after 3 weeks of combat. Around him were also about 30 civilians, Japanese colonists who had refused to surrender or commit suicide, who now looked to him for leadership. General Saito was dead. Admiral Nagumo was dead. Most senior officers were dead. The chain of command had collapsed, but Oba was alive, and he had no intention of surrendering. If the war was lost on Saipan, he would continue fighting anyway. Orders or no orders, command structure or no command structure. He would resist until killed or until legitimate authority told him to stop. Oba's decision to continue resistance was both rational and insane. Rational because Japanese military culture made surrender unthinkable, because he still had weapons and ammunition, because the terrain favored guerrilla warfare. Insane because continued resistance served no military purpose, because he had no possibility of victory or reinforcement, because every day of fighting simply delayed the inevitable. But Oba wasn't thinking strategically. He was thinking tactically, personally, culturally. Surrender meant dishonor. Fighting meant honor. The choice was simple, even if the outcome was predetermined. He would fight until he couldn't fight anymore. His men agreed. Not one suggested surrender. They would follow Oba into whatever came next, whether that was death or something else. The first raid came in September 1944, 3 months after the battle officially ended. Oba led a nighttime attack on a CB construction site near Tanapag Harbor. His men crept through the jungle, avoiding American patrols, and reached the construction site at 2 a.m. They stole food, medical supplies, and tools, then vanished back into the mountains before anyone realized they were there. The raid was professional, disciplined, bloodless. Oba had ordered his men not to kill unless necessary. Killing Americans would bring massive retaliation. Stealing supplies allowed survival. The distinction was crucial. Oba wasn't trying to win anything. He was trying to survive while maintaining his honor as a soldier. American forces on Saipan were initially embarrassed by these raids, then alarmed. How could Japanese soldiers still be operating 3 months after the island was secured? How many were there? Where were they hiding? Patrols were organized to hunt down the holdouts, but Saipan's terrain made hunting nearly impossible. The island had hundreds of caves, thousands of acres of jungle, and rough ground. A small force that knew the terrain and avoided direct confrontation could survive indefinitely. American commanders considered Oba's group a nuisance more than a threat, but a nuisance that had to be eliminated. The patrols continued, sweeping likely areas, checking caves, trying to locate and destroy the holdouts. December 1944. Oba's force had survived 6 months past the battle's end. They lived in caves, moving frequently to avoid detection. They survived on a diet of coconuts, sweet potatoes stolen from abandoned farms, and occasionally food stolen from American supplies. They had no medicine except what they could steal. Wounded men died from infections that antibiotics would have cured. Sick men recovered or didn't, depending on their constitution. The group that had numbered 46 soldiers in July had been reduced to 38 by December. Some had died from wounds or disease. Others had been killed in brief contacts with American patrols, but the survivors had become expert at staying hidden, moving without leaving traces, surviving on almost nothing. The American approach to Oba's group evolved over time. Initial efforts at aggressive pursuit gave way to containment and propaganda. Loudspeakers were set up near areas where the holdouts were believed to hide, broadcasting messages in Japanese. The messages explained that the war was over on Saipan, that General Saito and Admiral Nagumo were dead. That continued resistance was pointless. Some messages invoked the emperor's authority, suggesting that surrender now would honor the emperor by preserving Japanese lives. Oba, listening to these broadcasts from his cave, assumed they were lies, American propaganda designed to trick him into surrendering. The war couldn't be over. Japan couldn't have lost. The messages had to be false. March 1945. Oba's force was down to 46 men, the same number he had started with, though not the same individuals. Some had died, a few new stragglers had joined. The composition had changed, but the size remained constant. They had now survived 9 months past Saipan's fall. They watched daily as B-29 bombers took off from the airfields below, heading north to bomb Japan. Oba understood what this meant. American forces had turned Saipan into a base for attacking the homeland. His continued resistance couldn't prevent this, but he continued anyway because stopping meant surrender, and surrender remained unthinkable. He led occasional raids, stealing supplies, always avoiding combat when possible. His objective wasn't to fight Americans. It was to remain Japanese soldiers, to maintain their identity and honor, to not become prisoners. The psychological strain on Oba's men was immense. They lived in constant fear of discovery, constant hunger, constant uncertainty. They had no news from the outside world except American propaganda. They didn't know if Japan was winning or losing the larger war. They didn't know if their families were alive. They existed in a bubble of isolation, cut off from everything except their immediate survival. Some men broke under the strain, becoming despondent or irrational. Oba had to maintain discipline and morale through sheer force of will, keeping his men focused on survival and on maintaining their identity as soldiers. It was leadership of the most difficult kind, leading men who had nothing to hope for except continued existence in impossible conditions. December 1st, 1945, 16 months after Saipan fell, 5 months after Japan surrendered. Oba heard aircraft approaching his position, not American planes, but a single Japanese aircraft. He watched as it circled, then dropped a package attached to a parachute. The package contained a letter from Imperial Japanese Army headquarters and a Japanese officer who had been flown to Saipan, specifically to meet with Oba. The letter, signed by senior commanders and authenticated with official seals, ordered Oba to surrender. The war was over. Japan had surrendered in August. The emperor himself had ordered all Japanese forces to lay down their arms. Oba read the letter 3 times, examining the seals, verifying the signatures. It was legitimate. The war was actually over. Japan had actually lost. Oba called his men together and read them the order. Some men wept, some refused to believe it, some demanded they fight on anyway, refusing to accept surrender. Oba explained, patiently and firmly, that they had done their duty. They had fought as long as honor required. Now, honor required obedience to legitimate orders from proper authority. The emperor had commanded them to surrender. They would obey. It took Oba 3 days to convince all his men to accept surrender. On December 1st, 1945, 512 days after the Battle of Saipan officially ended, Captain Oba led 46 soldiers out of their caves and surrendered to American forces. They wore what remained of their uniforms, carried their weapons, and marched in formation. They surrendered as soldiers, maintaining discipline and dignity to the end. The American soldiers who accepted their surrender were stunned. Men who had been living in caves for 16 months, who had survived on almost nothing, who had evaded capture for over a year, emerged looking gaunt, but maintaining military bearing. Oba saluted the American officer receiving his surrender, turned over his samurai sword, and formally surrendered his command. The American officer, not knowing quite how to handle the situation, returned the salute and accepted the sword. Oba and his men were taken to a POW facility, given medical examinations, fed, and interrogated. They answered questions honestly, described their actions over the past 16 months, explained how they had survived. Their story spread through military channels, becoming legendary, the longest holdout of the Pacific War. Oba returned to Japan after the war, where he became a symbol of dedication and perseverance. Some viewed him as a hero who had refused to surrender. Others viewed him as a fool who had prolonged pointless resistance. Oba himself had mixed feelings about his actions. He had done his duty as he understood it. He had maintained his honor and that of his men. But he also recognized that his resistance had accomplished nothing strategically. The war had ended without him. His 16 months in the caves had changed nothing except delaying his own surrender. Was that admirable or foolish? Oba never definitively answered that question, even in his own mind. He had been a soldier. He had fought until ordered to stop. What else could he have done? The answer depended on whether you valued honor or pragmatism, duty or results, symbolic resistance or practical accommodation. For Oba, honor and duty had been paramount. Everything else was secondary. His last stand on Saipan hadn't changed the war's outcome, but it had proven something about human capacity for endurance, about the power of cultural conditioning, about what men would suffer for reasons they believed were sufficient. Whether those reasons actually were sufficient remained debatable, but their power to motivate resistance, even in hopeless circumstances, was undeniable. Captain Oba had demonstrated that power for 512 days, in caves on Saipan, fighting a war that had already been lost. July 18th, 1944, Tokyo. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo stood in the Imperial Palace, facing the Emperor and the Privy Council. The news from Saipan was unambiguous. The island had fallen, 31,000 soldiers dead, the entire garrison lost. American forces now occupied the island and were building airfields within B-29 range of Tokyo. The strategic ring that was supposed to protect Japan had been broken. Tojo had led Japan's military government since October 1941, had guided the decision to attack Pearl Harbor, had overseen 3 years of war. Now he faced the consequences of Saipan's loss. The council members sat in silence, their expressions making clear what was coming. Tojo submitted his resignation. The emperor accepted it. For the first time in the war, a major political casualty resulted directly from military defeat. Saipan hadn't just cost men and materiel, it had cost Japan's government its confidence. The political earthquake in Tokyo rippled through Japan's military and civilian leadership. If Saipan's loss could bring down the prime minister, what would happen when the next island fell? What would happen when American forces invaded the Philippines, or Okinawa, or the home islands themselves? The certainty that had characterized Japan's leadership in the war's early years had evaporated. Now there were doubts, whispers of negotiation, secret discussions about how to end the war on terms less catastrophic than unconditional surrender. These discussions remained theoretical in July 1944, But Saipan had opened the door to thinking about defeat, and that door would never fully close again. November 24, 1944. Saipan. General Curtis LeMay stood on the airfield, watching B-29s take off for the first major raid on Tokyo. LeMay commanded the 21st Bomber Command, responsible for strategic bombing of Japan from the Marianas. He was 38 years old, already legendary for his aggressive tactics and his willingness to accept risks to achieve results. The raid he was launching consisted of 111 bombers, each carrying thousands of pounds of explosives. The target was Tokyo's Nakajima aircraft engine factory. The raid would test whether strategic bombing from the Marianas could actually damage Japan's war production. LeMay watched the bombers disappear into the distance and waited for results. The first raids were disappointing. B-29s bombed from 30,000 feet, trying to hit factories with precision bombing through cloud cover and smoke. The results were poor. Most bombs missed their targets. The damage to Japanese industry was minimal. LeMay analyzed the failures and concluded that tactics had to change. High-altitude precision bombing wasn't working. He decided to switch to low-altitude area bombing, using incendiary bombs instead of high explosives, targeting cities instead of specific factories. This decision would transform the strategic bombing campaign from limited industrial raids to wholesale destruction of Japanese urban areas. It would also raise profound moral questions about the bombing of civilians. March 9th to 10th, 1945, Operation Meeting House. LeMay launched 334 B-29s from Saipan and Tinian to bomb Tokyo with incendiary weapons. The bombers flew at low altitude, 5,000 to 7,000 feet, and dropped tons of napalm and thermite incendiaries on a 16-square-mile area of downtown Tokyo. The incendiaries created a firestorm, winds of hurricane force feeding flames that reached thousands of degrees. 16 square miles of Tokyo burned. Approximately 100,000 civilians died in one night. More than would die in either atomic bomb attack. Another 1 million civilians were left homeless. The raid was the deadliest single-air attack of World War II. It was also devastatingly effective at destroying Japanese war production, as the targeted area contained hundreds of small factories and workshops. The strategic bombing campaign from the Marianas continued through spring and summer 1945. B-29s attacked 67 Japanese cities, systematically destroying urban areas with incendiary raids. By war's end, 147 square miles of Japanese cities had been burned. Millions of civilians were homeless, and Japanese war production had been severely degraded. The campaign required 33,000 B-29 sorties from the Marianas, dropping 104,000 tons of bombs. The logistical achievement of sustaining such operations from bases 6,000 miles from California was as impressive as the bombing itself. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every spare part had to be transported across the Pacific. The supply chain required thousands of ships and tens of thousands of personnel. But did strategic bombing actually shorten the war? This question remained intensely controversial decades later. Advocates argued that strategic bombing destroyed Japanese industry, broke civilian morale, and made continued resistance impossible. Critics argued that Japan's military leadership wasn't influenced by civilian casualties, that bombing strengthened rather than weakened resistance, that the resources devoted to strategic bombing would have been better used supporting ground operations. The debate couldn't be conclusively resolved because Japan surrendered after 2 atomic bombs, making it impossible to determine whether conventional strategic bombing alone would have forced surrender. The atomic bomb's connection to Saipan was direct. The 2 B-29s that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Enola Gay and Bockscar, flew from Tinian, launched from runways built by Seabees after Saipan's capture. Without Saipan, the atomic bombs couldn't have been delivered to their targets. The entire strategic concept of ending the war through air power depended on bases within range of Japan. Saipan and Tinian provided those bases. The 16,851 casualties suffered capturing Saipan had enabled the strategic bombing campaign, including the atomic bombs. This chain of causation meant Saipan's cost had to be evaluated in terms of its contribution to ending the war. If you believe strategic bombing and atomic weapons shortened the war and saved lives overall, then Saipan's casualties were justified. If you question that belief, then Saipan's costs seemed excessive. In July 1945, American planners were calculating casualties for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan. The plan called for two massive invasions: Operation Olympic against Kyushu in November 1945 and Operation Coronet against Honshu in March 1946. Expected casualties ranged from 500,000 to over 1 million Americans killed and wounded. Japanese casualties were expected to be vastly higher, possibly tens of millions when civilian resistance was included. These projections were based on Saipan and subsequent battles, where Japanese forces fought to annihilation and civilians chose death over surrender. If Saipan's patterns held for the home islands, the invasion would be the bloodiest operation in human history. These casualty projections informed President Truman's decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Truman and his advisors believed that demonstrating the atomic bomb's power would convince Japan to surrender without invasion. They were correct. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, after the second atomic bomb and Soviet entry into the war. Whether Japan would have surrendered without atomic weapons remained unknowable. What was certain was that Saipan's lessons about Japanese willingness to fight to extinction had convinced American planners that invasion would be catastrophically costly. The atomic bombs offered an alternative. Truman took it. The strategic significance of Saipan extended beyond enabling strategic bombing. Saipan's fall broke Japan's inner defensive ring, exposed the Philippines to invasion, and made Japan's home islands vulnerable to direct attack. Every subsequent American victory in the Pacific was built on Saipan's capture. Tinian fell 10 days after Saipan was secured. Guam was retaken in August. The Philippines were invaded in October. Iwo Jima and Okinawa fell in early 1945. Each operation brought American forces closer to Japan. Each operation's planning was informed by lessons learned on Saipan. And each operation was supported logistically from bases established after Saipan's capture. Saipan was the hinge on which the Pacific War turned. Before Saipan, Japan still held an outer defensive perimeter and could imagine avoiding invasion. After Saipan, that perimeter was broken, invasion was inevitable, and Japan's defeat was certain. Only the method and cost of that defeat remained to be determined. LeMay, watching B-29s return from raids throughout spring and summer 1945, understood that he was prosecuting a new kind of warfare, strategic bombing aimed at destroying an enemy's capacity and will to fight by attacking their cities, industry, and population. It was warfare that blurred the line between combatants and civilians, that accepted mass civilian casualties as necessary to achieve strategic goals. LeMay believed this approach was morally justified because it shortened the war and saved lives overall by making invasion unnecessary. Critics then and later questioned whether this justification was valid, whether deliberately targeting civilians could ever be justified, regardless of strategic benefits. The debate over strategic bombing's morality would continue long after the war ended, but the bombing's effectiveness at destroying Japanese cities was undeniable. From Saipan's runways, American air power had systematically destroyed Japan's urban areas, made continued war increasingly untenable, and contributed significantly to Japan's surrender. Whether this contribution justified the civilian casualties inflicted remained a question that each person had to answer according to their own moral framework. There were no easy answers. There was only the historical fact: Saipan made strategic bombing possible. Strategic bombing helped end the war, and ending the war required destruction on a scale that still haunted everyone who participated in or studied it. June 15, 1984. Saipan. Veterans of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions returned to the island for the 40th anniversary of the invasion. They were old men now, 60s and 70s, some in wheelchairs, some walking with canes. They had traveled thousands of miles to see again the island where they had fought, where their friends had died, where they had experienced the defining event of their lives. they gathered on the beaches where they had landed 40 years earlier. The beaches looked different now, peaceful, tourist-friendly, with no trace of the violence that had occurred there, but the veterans remembered. As they stood on Red Beach and Green Beach and Yellow Beach, they were 19 and 20 years old again, climbing out of Amtraks, running through machine gun fire, watching men die. The battlefield tour took them inland to places they remembered: Death Valley, Purple Heart Ridge, Mount Tapochau. The terrain looked smaller now, less imposing. How had these hills seemed so enormous in 1944? How had these ridges been so difficult to climb? But the veterans understood that the difficulty hadn't been physical geography. It had been the defenders, the bullets and shells, the exhaustion and fear. The terrain was just terrain. What made it deadly was the men shooting from it. Those men were gone now, dead for 40 years, buried in graves or left in sealed caves. The current generation of Japanese and Americans were at peace. But for these veterans, the war would never be entirely over. They lived with it every day, in memories and nightmares, in scars, physical and psychological. At Marpy Point, the veterans stood at the cliff's edge, looking down at rocks and ocean far below. Some Japanese survivors were there too, elderly people who had been children in 1944, who remembered the battle, who had lost family members to suicide or combat. The Americans and Japanese met awkwardly, unsure how to interact, burdened by history. Then someone suggested placing flowers at the cliff's edge, a memorial for all who died. Americans and Japanese worked together, arranging flowers, speaking quietly, sometimes crying. It was reconciliation of a sort, insufficient to heal the wounds, but meaningful nonetheless. The war was over. The people who fought it were dying. The next generation would inherit the memory without the trauma. Maybe that was enough. In 1995, a historian at the National Archives discovered documents that shed new light on casualty projections for the invasion of Japan. The documents, classified for decades, showed that planners in 1945 expected Operation Downfall to cost between 500,000 and 1 million American casualties, with Japanese casualties possibly exceeding 10 million when civilian resistance was included. These projections were based directly on Saipan's casualty rates and the pattern of Japanese resistance observed there. If Saipan, with a garrison of 31,000, cost 16,851 American casualties, then Japan, with millions of defenders, would cost proportionally more. The documents proved that the atomic bomb decision was informed by Saipan's lessons about Japanese willingness to fight to extinction. The physical remains of the battle scattered across modern Saipan served as reminders of what occurred. Rusting tanks sat in the jungle, slowly being consumed by vegetation. Concrete bunkers stood intact, their gun ports still covering beaches. Cave systems remained, some sealed, others open and accessible. Underwater, dozens of shipwrecks littered the ocean floor, testament to the naval forces that supported the invasion. These physical remnants would last decades or centuries, gradually deteriorating, but present as evidence. Future generations could visit and see tangible remains of the battle, but the physical evidence couldn't convey the human experience. The fear, the pain, the loss, the moral complexity of what happened. The lessons applied from Saipan influenced the remainder of the Pacific War. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, American forces used tactics developed on Saipan: systematic cave clearing, tank infantry coordination, emphasis on flamethrowers and demolitions. The battle lasted 36 days and cost 27,000 American casualties. At Okinawa, from April to June 1945, the patterns from Saipan repeated on a larger scale. Japanese forces defending in depth, mass civilian casualties, suicide attacks, grinding attrition. Okinawa cost 49,000 American casualties and an estimated 150,000 Japanese military and civilian deaths. Both battles validated the lessons from Saipan and reinforced the conclusion that invading Japan would be catastrophically costly. The alternate history question haunted historians for decades. What if Saipan had failed? What if Japanese forces had repulsed the invasion, inflicted casualties so severe that American public opinion turned against continuing the war? The answer was unknowable, but the question important. Saipan was a calculated risk, a massive operation that could have gone wrong in dozens of ways. If the naval bombardment had been less effective, if the landing had been more heavily opposed, if Japanese counterattacks had broken through to the beaches, the outcome might have been different. But it hadn't gone wrong. American forces had captured the island despite heavy casualties, and that capture had enabled everything that followed: strategic bombing, atomic weapons, Japan's eventual surrender. Saipan's success was contingent, fragile, dependent on thousands of individual actions and decisions that could have turned out differently, but they hadn't. And that made all the difference. Some veterans struggled to articulate what Saipan meant to them. How could you explain to someone who hadn't been there what it was like to fight for 3 weeks on a small island, to watch friends die, to kill men at close range, to see civilians choosing death over capture? The experience was incomprehensible to those who hadn't lived it. Veterans fell back on understatement and dark humor, coping mechanisms that allowed them to talk about the battle without fully expressing its emotional reality. Asked if Saipan was worth the cost, most veterans said yes, because the strategic results justified the casualties, because defeating Japan required capturing Saipan, because they believed their sacrifice had meaning. But some veterans questioned whether strategic necessity actually justified the human cost, whether there might have been alternatives, whether the price paid was too high even for strategic victory. The civilian tragedy at Saipan, particularly Marpy Point, cast a long shadow over the battle's legacy. 10,000 civilian deaths, many from suicide encouraged by propaganda and coercion, raised profound questions about psychological warfare and cultural conditioning. Could American forces have done more to prevent civilian deaths? Probably, though the military's primary focus was combat operations, not civilian protection. Should Japanese military forces be held responsible for encouraging or forcing civilian suicides? Absolutely, though this responsibility was rarely emphasized in post-war narratives. The civilian deaths at Saipan foreshadowed what might have happened during an invasion of Japan, where millions of civilians might have been killed by combat, suicide, or starvation. This grim prospect influenced the decision to use atomic weapons, which killed hundreds of thousands but potentially prevented millions of deaths during invasion. The modern significance of Saipan extended beyond historical interest. The battle demonstrated what happens when military forces fight with no possibility of compromise, when cultural conditioning removes surrender as an option, when ideology values death over survival. These patterns weren't unique to World War II Japan. They recurred in other conflicts, other contexts, wherever fanaticism overcame pragmatism. Saipan was a case study in the human cost of absolutist thinking, the price paid when negotiation becomes impossible and only total victory or total annihilation remain. The lessons were grim but important. Wars without possibility of compromise are the costliest wars. Ideologies that forbid surrender produce unnecessary casualties, and technological advantage doesn't prevent suffering when facing determined resistance. As the sun set on Saipan during the 40th anniversary commemoration, the veterans gathered one more time at the cemetery. Chaplains from multiple faiths conducted services. Names of the dead were read aloud, thousands of names, taking hours to recite. The veterans listened in silence, remembering. Some had survivor's guilt, wondering why they had lived when so many friends had died. Others felt pride at having done their duty, having fought courageously, having contributed to victory. Most felt both simultaneously, the complex mixture of emotions that combat veterans carry. The service ended with taps, the haunting bugle call echoing across the cemetery. Then the veterans dispersed, some to never return, some to come back year after year until age prevented travel. The ultimate judgment on Saipan remained contested. Was it a necessary battle that enabled strategic bombing and shortened the war? Or was it one of many bloody campaigns in a war that could have ended differently? The answer depended on what alternatives you believed existed, what weight you gave to military necessity versus human suffering, whether you judged the past by its own standards or by modern values. There were no definitive answers, only perspectives shaped by personal experience, historical knowledge, and moral philosophy. What couldn't be contested was the cost. 16,851 American casualties, 40,000 Japanese military and civilian deaths, an island transformed from thriving colony to blasted battlefield. And what couldn't be denied was the outcome. American forces captured Saipan, built airfields, launched strategic bombing campaigns that helped end the war. Fire and blood had purchased strategic victory. Whether that victory justified the fire and blood remained a question each person had to answer individually. The legacy of Saipan lived on in the men who fought there, in the families who lost sons and fathers, in the strategic consequences that flowed from its capture, in the moral questions it raised about war's conduct and cost. It lived on in military doctrine developed from lessons learned, in memorial services held annually, in preserved battlefields and monuments. But most importantly, it lived on as a reminder of what humans will endure for causes they believe in, what sacrifices they will make, what suffering they will inflict and accept. Saipan was tragedy and triumph simultaneously. A necessary battle fought at terrible cost, a victory achieved through industrial-scale death. Its story contained no comfortable lessons, no simple morals, only the hard truth that sometimes achieving strategic objectives requires accepting casualties on a scale that haunts everyone involved. The fire and blood of Saipan purchased something significant, bases from which to attack Japan, momentum toward eventual victory, proof that Japan's defensive ring could be broken. But the price was almost unbearable. 25 days of combat, 16,851 American casualties, 40,000 Japanese deaths, an island soaked in blood and burned by fire. That was Saipan's legacy. That was the price of victory. And decades after the battle ended, veterans standing on Saipan's peaceful beaches still wondered if there could have been another way, a path to victory that cost less in human suffering. They found no answers, only memories, and the knowledge that they had done what was asked of them, had paid the price demanded, and had survived to tell the story. That would have to be enough.